Hey everyone, and welcome back to Daily Tuition. In this course, you are going to learn a very amazing quiz application with MERN Stack. We're going to make this beautiful quiz app with MongoDB, React, Node, and Express. Let's see what we are going to build in this course. We are going to first display all the rules of this quiz and allow user to specify their username. We are only allowed to authorize user to access this quiz. So if I try to click on the start quiz, this won't going to start because we won't allow user to access the quiz without specifying their username. So let's suppose if I specify here username, Daily Tuition, click on the start button, then we're going to allow user to start the quiz. Now inside this quiz, each question has 3 options and user can only select one among 3. So let's suppose if I select this first option, and when you click on next, you're going to have the next question. Just select the answer and click on next. You will notice here on the left side, you're also going to have here a previous button. You can click on this previous button and move to your previous question and see your answer. If you want, you can update your answer. Let's suppose that you want to change this answer. You click on this first option, and when you back to the previous question, this will update your answer. Now let's specify all the answers. And now when you finish your exam, you will see your result. You're going to have your username, total quiz points, which is 50, total questions, total attempts, and earn points from this quiz, and the result. And we're going to store all this result in the backend and display that right inside this table. And we are going to store all this data in the MongoDB database. And when you click on this restart button, it will restart the quiz. We are going to build this really from the scratch. So you're going to learn problem solving skill to tackle programming challenges and learn many new techniques to make your application easy to build. Using this course, you will be able to improve your logical skill. So before you move on, make sure you first install the editor to write the code. I'm using VS Code editor to create this complete application. And then you have to install Node inside your machine. And you also need to have a browser to run your web application. Once you have it, you're good to go. So enough talking, let's dive into a real world example. Let's get started and see how to make this amazing application with MERN Stack. I'm going to open the Visual Studio Code, and inside it, I'm going to open the empty folder. Here, inside this empty folder, I'm going to create a new directory, a new project directory, and name this directory quiz app. And inside this quiz app, I'm going to have 2 folders. So here inside this quiz app, I'm going to create 2 folders. First for the client, and second for the server. Inside this client folder, I'm going to put my React application, and inside this server folder, I'm going to put the Node with Express framework. So inside this client, I have the front end, and inside the server, I'm going to have my backend. So let's first start with the front end. Inside this client, let me just initialize this client folder with React application. So let me open my terminal, enter into my project directory. So I'm going to say here cd quiz app. And inside this quiz app, as you know, we have 2 folders, client and server. So I'm going to say here cd client, and I'm going to initialize this folder as a React project. To initialize this, I need to say npx create React app and then specify here dot. To indicate I'm using the current directory as a React project. I'm going to press enter. So this is going to initialize this current project as a React project. Now, once you have your React application, you can see you have this command cd enter into the project directory and then specify a command called npm start. This command allows you to start the development server. So I'm already in the client directory, so I'm going to clear the screen and I'm going to say here npm start. So this will start the application on the localhost 3000. You can see this will start the development server on the localhost 3000. And now let me just open the client folder, and here I have the source directory where we can have all the React components. Inside this, I also have the unnecessary files which I'm not using in this project. So let me just delete all that unnecessary files. Now because we are not working on the app testing, I'm going to get rid of this apptest.js file. I'm also going to get rid of this setup test file, this web vital file, and then I'm going to get rid of this file as well. So I'm going to delete this file, this logo.svg. And I'm going to back to the index.js, and here I need to change few code here. Get rid of this web vital function and this import statement. Save the changes, and you're going to have this error. This is because inside this app.js, you have this logo file. Let me just get rid of that file as well and get rid of all this unwanted code right from here and put here h1 heading tag with React app title. Save this file. You can see now the React app compiled successfully. So now we can move ahead and create all the components for this application. So inside this source folder, let me just create a folder and name this folder components. Inside this components folder, I'm going to have all my components of this project. So let me just put this app.js component inside this components folder. So let me grab this file and put that inside this components folder. And I'm going to do the same for this app.css and this index.css. Let me create a new folder for that. So let me just create here a folder style, or you can say styles. And I'm going to put all my stylings inside this folder. So I'm going to put both these files right inside this styles folder. Something like this. And inside this index.js, you have to just specify that components.app and save all the changes. And then you have to specify here // specify styles. And inside this, you have index.css file. And then back to the app.js. And here you also need to change this styling. So here we specify // specify styles. And here we have app.css file. Just after that, I need to install few libraries inside this project. So I'm going to open the terminal, create a new terminal, enter into the project directory. So I'm going to say here cd, quiz app, and the client folder. Here, I'm going to install few libraries. So I'm going to say here npm i4 install, and then I'm going to first install React Redux to create central store inside this application. We are using Redux library, and then I'm going to install React Router DOM. We are using this library to create routing, and just after that I'm going to install Axios library to make the API call. Let me install all these three libraries inside this project. So I'm going to press enter and install all these three libraries. I'm going to back to my compile terminal, close this tab, and I'm going to open my app.js file. And if I open my localhost 3000, then you will notice here this React application. What I want to make different routes for this application first, and then create different components for that. So inside this app component, I'm going to create all my routes. To create routes, I need to use React Router DOM library. So at the top, right up here, I need to first say import in the object from React Router DOM. And from this library, I'm going to import create browser router and router provider. So to make a route, I'm going to first add here a command and say React routers, and here I'm going to create a constant variable router is equal to, and then say create browser router, this function. And then inside this, I'm going to add an array of objects. So I'm going to first add an array, and inside that we have an object. This object is represent the route path. So we first specify the path property like this. And this path is for a root route. So I'm going to pass here /. And then I also need to specify the element which represent this path. So I'm going to say here element. And just for now, I'm just going to say here div and say root element. Just after that, here I'm going to pass a comma, copy this object, specify that right down here and down here. The second path is for the quiz route. And I'm going to say here element quiz component. And let me do the same for this third route, but instead of quiz, we are going to say here result, and this is for the result component. Now let me save the changes. Just after that, right down here inside this app, instead of returning this division tag right here, I'm just going to return first this empty bracket, and from here you need to provide all these routes using this router provider. So right here, I'm going to say router provider, create this component. You can self-close this component like this if you want. And then you can specify here router name, which is router. That's it. Now when I save the changes, back to my project, if I zoom this a little bit, I'm going to have this root element on the localhost 3000. So this is for the root route. So this is my root component. If I open the quiz route, I'm going to have the quiz component. And if I open the result route, I'm going to have my result component. So you can see all the routing is now working. But instead of these division tags, I'm going to create and specify all the components here instead of this div. So inside these components right here, I'm going to create a new file, name this file main.js. Here I'm going to create React functional component, something like this. This represents the main component, and then I'm going to import that component inside this app. So here I'm going to first add a command and say import components, and down here I'm going to say import main from the main file. I'm going to import the main component and then specify that right here. So when I open the root route, I'm going to have my main component. Let's do the same thing for this quiz component. So let's create a new component here inside this component folder. Name this quiz.js. Here I'm going to say React functional component. I'm going to create a simple React functional component here back to the app.js. And then I'm going to say here import quiz from the quiz file, and then copy this quiz, and then I'm going to specify that here instead of this division tag, and do the same for this result as well. So I'm going to back to the component folder, create a new component, name this result.js, and then I'm going to say here React functional component, save this file, back to the app.js, and import here result from the result file, copy this, and then specify that right here. So now once we have all these three components, let's create this main.js component first. So inside this main.js component right here, instead of this main right here, let me get rid of this, and here I'm going to add h1 heading tag and then specify here title for this application, which is quiz application. And for this div, I'm going to specify class name. The class name is container. Now right now I don't have this class inside this .css file, but just for now I'm going to create this class, and to this h1 heading tag here I'm going to specify class name, title, and text light. Just out of that, here I'm going to add order list and specify here li tags. And then I'm going to add here some rules. So I'm going to say here, you will be asked 10 questions, one after another. So this is my first rule. So let me create all that rules right here inside this OL tag. So let me just copy all these rules and specify that right here, something like this. So I'm going to put all my rules here, and just out of this OL tag right here, I'm going to create a form. Get rid of this action attribute because we are not using it, and just specify here ID. The ID is going to be form. Inside this form, I'm going to create input of the type text, and then I'm going to specify here placeholder. Placeholder is going to be the username, and this is the required field. So I'm going to pass here asterisk, and I'm going to get this input text box value using useref reactor. So at the top right here, I'm going to say here constant input ref and call here useref reactor. When I enter, you can see this will automatically import this useref hook at the top inside this import statement, and then I just need to specify here a parenthesis and specify the default value. And then to access the value of this input text box, you need to just specify this input ref to the reference property. So we specify here reference, and then specify here input ref, this variable. That's it. Now you can access the value of this input text box using this input reference variable. Just out of that, just out of this form right down here, I'm also going to have here a division tag, and this division tag is for the start button. So I'm going to say here class name start, and here I'm going to add a link component, and I'm going to get this link component from the React router DOM. So at the top here, I need to first say import in the object. I want to import the link component from the React router DOM. I'm going to get that link component right here, link, and then here I'm going to first specify class names. Class names is going to be btn, and I'm going to specify here two property. this to property allows us to navigate the user to the different location. So I wanted to navigate the user to the quiz route. So here I'm going to pass quiz. So when the user click on this link component, user then navigate to this quiz route. I just saw that right here inside this link component. Here I'm going to say start quiz. So when the user click on this link component, I'm going to navigate him to the quiz route. That's it. Let me save the changes, back to my project and open the root route. And I'm going to back to the app.js, save this file, and you can see I'm going to have the results something like this. What I want to style this component. So I'm going to back to the app.css right here and toggle this window on the right side so you can see everything clearly. Let me just zoom this out a little bit. And right here, I'm going to copy all the CSS right from my finished project and specify that right here. Now, because we are working on the MERN Stack application, I'm not going to focus on the styling. So I'm just going to copy and paste all the code right from my finished project and specify that right inside this app.css. You can easily download this file from the first Git branch. Let me just save the changes. You can see I'm going to have the results something like this. Don't worry, you don't have to write this code manually. Instead, you can open the main component branch and copy this code and follow along with me. So once we have this code, I need to specify styling to this input text box and this start button. For that, instead of adding styling to the input text box and to the button, I'm going to just add styling to this main component inside the main.css file. So inside this style folder, then I'm going to create a new file main.css. And inside this, I'm going to put all the styling of this main component. So I'm going to copy the styling of the main component and specify that right inside this file. So now let me just save the changes, back to the main.js, and right up here, don't forget to import in the single quote // specify styles. And here I need to import main.css file. Save the changes, and here I'm going to have the result. But still I don't have styling to this input text box. This is because if I back to the main.css, here I have user ID class for the input text box. So let me just specify that user ID class to the input text box. So I'm going to back to the main.js right here to this input text box. Let me specify class name, which is user ID. There it is, and I'm going to have the result what I want. Now just out of that, when the user click on this start quiz, I want to navigate the user to the quiz route. So when I click on the start quiz, you can see user is now redirected to the quiz route. This is because we have here two property with the quiz route path. Now once the user redirect to the quiz route right here, let me just create the quiz component first. So I'm going to back to the quiz.js, and here I'm going to create the quiz component. So let's make this quiz component. So now let's make the quiz component. So I'm going to back to the quiz.js right here. And here I'm simply going to get rid of this quiz right from here, and then specify class names to this division tag, and then specify here container. And inside this div, here I'm going to add h1 heading tag and specify the title for this quiz component. Now because I'm using the same title, I'm going to copy this title and specify that right here. Something like this. Just start that right down here. I'm going to display all my components. So here I'm going to create a command and say display questions. And instead of adding all the questions right inside this component, I'm going to create a dedicated component for the questions. And then I'm going to put all the questions UI inside that component. So I'm going to leave this as it is just for now. And right down here, I'm going to create a div with the class grid. And right inside this class, here I'm going to add a button for the next and previous. So I'm going to first create here a button for the next, and at the top before this next, I'm going to create a button for previous. There it is, and you can see I'm going to have this previous and next button. Now what I want to specify some styling to it. So to this first button right here, I'm going to specify some class names. First is btn and second class is previous. Save this, and I'm going to have all the predefined styling to this button. Don't have to write any styling because we have all the styling of this quiz inside this main.css file. Just out of that, I'm going to back to the quiz.js. To this next button, I'm also going to specify styling. So I'm going to say here btn and next. Save this, and here I'm going to have the styling to this next button as well. Along with these buttons, I also need to add here on click event. So when I click on the next button, I want to execute the on next event handler. And when I click on the previous button, I want to execute the on previous event handler. So let me just add here on click event, and I'm going to call a function right up here. Name this function on next. Let me specify here console.log on next click. I'm going to execute this on next when I click on this next button, and let me do the same for the previous button. So at the top, right down here, I'm going to specify on previous. So when I click on the previous button, I'm going to call this on previous. So let me just specify here on click, and here I'm going to say on previous. Let me just save the changes, open the inspect tool, and let me just open the console.log. Here, when I click on the next button, it's going to call the on next event handler, and when I click on this previous button, it's going to call the previous on click event handler. Just for now, I'm going to leave everything as it is, and let me just add here a comment: next button event handler, and I'm going to copy this, specify that here, and this is for previous button event handler. Once we have the quiz component, let's create all the questions inside this quiz component. So instead of creating all the UI of the questions inside this quiz component, let me create a new component for that and put that component right here. Now, let's make the questions component inside this component folder. Now, if you want, you can put this component inside the inner folder as well. That's upon you. But instead of creating a new folder inside these components, I'm going to create a new file here and name this component questions.js. And now, because this component is a child component of this quiz, that's upon you. You can put this component inside the inner folder or in different location. That's upon you. I'm going to put this inside this component folder, and just out of that right here, I'm going to call this questions component. So I'm going to say here questions. Now, because I don't have these questions right up here, so I need to first import that. I'm going to say import questions from dot / and then I'm going to specify the questions. Now, because I don't have any code right here, that is why I'm not going to get any auto completion to this code. If I add here React functional component, save this file back to this quiz.js, and if I get it of this import, if I say here questions, then you can notice I have this auto completion here. I can easily add the question component right here, copy this and specify that here and call my component, something like this. Now that's upon you. You can use this opening and closing component tag, or you can self-close this component like this. Now once we have this child component, let me save the changes back to the questions. Inside these questions, I'm going to get all the questions from the backend and display one by one inside this questions component. So let me just specify here first class name. Class name is going to be questions. Inside this div, here I'm going to add a h2 heading tag and then specify here class name. Class name is going to be text light. Then inside this h2, I'm going to specify here a question. So just for now, I'm just going to say here simple question 1. So this is just a demo text, and just out of that, here I'm going to add UL tag, and inside this UL, I'm going to have the li tag, and inside this li tag, I'm going to have my options. So I'm going to add here input of the type radio. I'm not going to create here input type text. Instead, I'm going to say here input type radio button. Here, I'm going to specify some properties. So let me just enter here, and then here I'm going to specify value. Value is just for now, I'm going to specify true as a default value. Then specify name. Name property is going to be options. Then I'm going to specify ID. ID is going to be question 1 option. And then I'm going to specify here on change event handler. So when I click on this radio button, I want to call the on change event handler. So I'm going to call here on change, and then I'm going to specify my on select event handler here. Now, because I don't have the on select event handler, so at the top here, if I create a function on select, something like this with console.log, so I can say here radio button change, and I'm going to call this on select right here. Save the changes back to the project. Right here, you can see I'm going to have here radio button change. This is because I have the value of this radio button true by default. But if right up here, if I call use state React hook, something like this, this will automatically import this React hook at the top inside these curly braces from the React module. Here I'm going to say constant. In the array, I'm going to specify check and set check. And then I'm going to specify default value here, undefined. And then I'm going to specify this check value right here. I'm simply going to call here this set check, something like this. And then you can specify here true to change the value of this input text box. Just for now, I'm going to leave everything as it is. Let me save this and reload the browser. Right now you can see inside my console, I'm going to have two console messages. What I want only one console message. So I'm going to back to the index.js and get rid of this strict mode right from here. I don't want two console messages. So let me get rid of this. Save this and you can see I'm going to have only one console message. Now because I have true here, I'm going to have this console message. But you can see I don't have here the radio button. This is because in the styling, I'm not using this radio button to make the selection. Instead, we are using the label to represent the radio button. Right down here, I'm going to say label and then specify label for this radio button. So I'm going to copy this ID and specify that right here. And then to this radio button, I'm going to specify class name, which is going to be text primary. And after that, inside this label, here I'm going to specify the options. So I'm going to just specify here option. And after that, to this input text box right here, I'm going to create a div and then specify here class name. The class name is going to be check and check. Save the changes and you can see I'm going to have my option here. I'm using this division tag for this UI and this label for this option text. I already have all the styling of these questions inside the app.css file. If you scroll down, then you can notice here we have all the styling of this component. If you want, you can copy this styling and put that inside a dedicated style file as well. That's upon you. Now what you are going to do here inside the styling, when the user click on the radio button, I'm going to specify border, then specify the background color and primary color to the input type radio button. And then when I add this check to the division tag, I want to make the selection. If I get rid of this check class right from here, save the changes, and here I'm going to specify false and reload the browser. You can see I'm not going to have my selected option. This is because right here I have false and I don't have here check class. If I add here checked, save this, you can see this class will select this option. So using this class, you can check and uncheck this radio button. You don't have to worry about this value property. This class will automatically going to do that. We are using this class to check and uncheck the radio button. Don't worry, we will understand more about this class later in this course. Just for now, leave everything as it is. And now instead of just one option inside this question, you can duplicate this li tag and create 3 options for this question. Or you can get the data from the backend and iterate over this li tag and display all your options. So next, we are going to create a data.js file and make a mock data and pass that data to this front end. So now what I want, instead of creating all this UI by duplicating it, I'm going to get the data from the .js file and then iterate over this li tag. So inside this source folder right here, I'm going to create a new folder, name this folder database, and then inside this, I'm going to create a new file, name this file data.js, and inside this file, I'm simply going to export a default array. And inside this array, I'm going to have all my questions. So I'm going to put all my questions inside this array. You can see I'm going to have an object. So this object, I'm going to specify ID, question, and 3 options of this question. And I'm going to create here 5 questions, you can notice. And I'm going to iterate over this array of object and display all my questions one by one. Let me just save the changes. Then I'm going to back to the questions right here. And I'm going to import this data file. So I'm going to say here import data from the database.data file. So I'm going to have my data inside this data variable. So if I call here use effect, the React hook, and if I call console.log here and print the data variable. Then you will notice here, I'm going to have all my data inside the array of objects. And now I can iterate over this data and display all my questions. So what we're going to do is, when we have all these questions, I'm going to get one question from this file and display them right here. So inside my app, if I create here a constant variable, question is equal to, and if I call here data of 0, so this will just return the first question, right? So if I copy this and specify that right here, save the changes, then you will notice this will return the first question. Now I'm going to iterate over these options, this one, and print all the options right here. Right down here to this UL tag right here, I'm simply going to say key, and then I'm going to specify here question dot ID. I'm going to access this property ID, and I'm going to specify that to this UL tag. So this will just uniquely identify this UL tag. Just for that, I'm going to get rid of this li tag right from here, and instead of this li tag, I'm going to pass here an object and then specify here questions dot options. If you open your object, then you will notice here you have this options array. I'm going to iterate over this option array. So I'm going to say here options dot map. I'm using map function to iterate over this array, and then I'm going to pass here two parameters. First is question and second is index value. Inside this q variable, I'm going to have all my options, and inside this I have the index value, and then I'm going to call here a function, something like this, and instead of adding here curly braces, I'm going to add here parentheses, because with this parentheses I don't need to return anything. Parentheses will automatically return all the data from this map function. So inside this, here I'm going to add my li tag as it is, just like this. And don't forget to uniquely identify this element, otherwise React will return a warning. So let me just add here a key and specify here a question. Or you can also specify here an index. That's upon you. And then because we have three options, I need to uniquely specify a new ID to all my options. So instead of this question one option, I can access this I variable to uniquely specify the ID to all my options. So get rid of this hard-coded value right from here, something like this. Pass here an object and template string. And right inside this, I can say here Q, on here dollar. In the curly braces, I'm going to pass this I. Inside this I variable, I'm going to have the index value. We are going to have the 0, 1, and 2. So I'm going to access that value and specify that to this ID. And then I'm going to specify here options. So this will just uniquely identify each element. And I'm going to do the same for this HTML for as well. So I'm going to copy this and then specify that right here. And then instead of this question, I'm going to pass here Q, this option value. So inside this Q variable, I'm going to have my option value. So I'm going to pass that right here. Save the changes, and you can see I'm going to have all my options. But now let me just display my question as well. So right inside this simple question is instead of this hard-coded value, I'm going to get the question from the questions object. I'm going to pass here question. If you open the questions object, you can notice here we have the question in this question property. So I'm going to pass here dot question. Save the changes, and you can see I'm going to have my question here. That's it. And I reload the browser. You can see I'm going to have my question here. Now, if I want to unselect all the questions, I can just get rid of this check class right from here. When I save the changes, you can see this will unselect all these questions. Now, once we have the questions component, let's move on and see how to make this result component. Once we understand how to build questions component, let's take a look at how you can display result of the quiz inside the application. Let's move to the result component and create this result component and display the result of the user performance. So right inside this div right here, I'm going to specify some classes. Let me specify here class name, container, and right inside this div, I'm going to specify h1 heading tag, and I'm going to print my title here. So I'm going to copy this h1 heading tag right from the quiz and specify that right here inside this result, something like this. And then right down here, I'm going to add another div, and let me specify some classes here. First is result, and second is flex center. This will just center all the content. I'm using here a class called flex center. Inside this, I'm going to add here a div with some classes. So I'm going to add here flex class, and then I'm going to specify here a span tag. Inside this span tag, I'm going to specify the username. This will display the username, and I'm going to add here another span tag with the class name bold. This will add bold property to this span tag. And inside this, I'm just going to add here a simple hard-coded data. So I'm going to say here daily tuition. Let me save the changes to the project, and now let me open result route. You can see right now I don't have any styling to this result route. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new style.css file for the result. So inside this styles folder right here, I'm going to create a new file. Name this file result.css. And right inside this file, I'm going to put all the styling of this file. So I'm going to put all the CSS styling here, something like this. Don't worry, you can download this .css file from the result component 05 git branch. I'm going to specify styling here, back to the result, and at the top, don't forget to import this style. So I'm going to say import in the single quote. So specify here styles and result.css. Save the changes, and I'm going to have the styling of this result page. For that, let me just copy this div, specify that right here, and then instead of this username, right now I'm going to say total quiz points, and then I'm going to specify here total quiz points. I'm going to specify default value 50 here. Let me duplicate this 3 more times, and then get rid of this total quiz title, and here I'm going to say total questions. The default value is 5, and then I'm going to get rid of this. Here I'm going to specify total attempts, something like this, and total attempts is going to be 03, and then I'm going to specify here total earn points, and at the end I'm going to duplicate this division tag again, and I'm going to say here quiz result. And then get rid of this daily tuition right from here, and I'm going to print my quiz result here. I'm just going to say here pass. Save this, and I'm going to have my result inside this result route. Just for that, at the bottom right here, I want to add the restart button. So just after this division tag right down here, just after this div right down here, I'm going to add here a div again with the start class, and then I'm going to put a link component here. So I'm going to say here link. Because I don't have this link component inside this file, I'm going to add here link component first. So import link from the React Router DOM, and then I can use this link component here. I can say here class name btn, and specify here to property, and I'm going to navigate the user to the root route when the user click on this restart button. I'm going to say here the start, and don't forget to call here on click event handler. So I'm going to say here on click. When the user click on this restart button, I'm going to call this on click event handler. And to this on click event handler, I'm going to specify here a function. So let me just specify here function on restart, and then specify that function. So let me just specify here console.log on restart. Let me copy this on restart and specify that to this on click event handler. Save this file, and you can see I'm going to have this button here. When I click on it, this will just navigate me to the root route, and I'm going to have this console message on restart. Now, just for that, I also need to add the result table. So right inside this component, I'm going to create a new file. Name this file result table.js, and I'm going to call this result table file inside this result.js. Let me first add here React functional component. Save this, back to the result, right down here, just out of this div, I'm going to add here container. Inside this container, I'm going to put my result table. So let me first import that at the top. Here, I'm going to say import result table from the result table file, and let me just copy this and specify that right here. Save this, and I'm going to have this result table here. Now let me back to the result table. let me add UI for the result table component. Right inside this component, I'm just going to add a simple table and display all the data of the user and get all that data from the backend. So inside this div here, I'm going to add a table. Inside this table, we are going to have the table head and table body. Inside this table head, let me first specify class name. Right here, I'm going to specify table header is the class name for this table head. And then I'm going to add here table row. And then I'm going to add here class name table row. And inside this table row, I'm going to add table data. The first table data is going to be the name of the user. Duplicate this 3 more times. And then I'm going to specify here attempt. Then I'm going to display the points, the earn points. So I'm going to add here earn points. And then I'm going to add here result. So I'm going to display all this data in the table and pass value to it. So inside this table body right here, I'm going to add a new table row. Don't forget to specify class name here, table body. I already have styling to this table inside the result.css file. So I don't need to create any styling for these classes. Now just out that inside this table row, here I'm going to create table data. So I'm going to specify here username, daily tuition, something like this. Duplicate this. Then I'm going to get rid of this daily tuition. And then I'm going to specify attempts 03. Then I'm going to pass earn points, which is 20, and pass or fail result. So just for now, I'm going to specify here pass. Save the changes and back to the result file. You can see I'm going to have the user result inside this table. I already have styling of this table inside the result.css file right here. You can find all the styling of this table right here. If you want, you can change the styling using this result.css file. That's upon you. And now inside this result.js right here, let me just add a command to indicate this is the result table. That's it. Save the changes. And now we have the result component, what I want. Now, once we have all the routes of this project, let's move and understand how to create a central store and pass data between all these components. As you know, we have the main component on the route, quiz component on the quiz route, and result component on the result route. What I want to create a central store so we can pass data between all these components. What we can do is we can create a Redux store so we can pass all the data using a central store. Let me show you how I can create a central store for this application. Let me get rid of all these files right from here, and inside this source folder right here, I'm going to create another folder, name this folder Redux, and inside this Redux folder, I'm going to create a new file with the name store.js. And then inside the store file, I'm going to create a central store for this client React application. I'm going to use Redux toolkit. So I'm going to open my terminal, and here I'm going to enter into my project directory, and here I'm going to say npm I for install, and I'm going to install a library called Redux.js toolkit, and I'm going to press enter, and this will install this library inside this project. Using Redux toolkit, it's super easy to create a store in the React application. And then I'm going to open the package.json, and here you can notice I'm going to have this Redux.js toolkit package installed in the React application. Just out of that, I'm going to back to the store.js. Here I'm going to create a new store. So we need first configure store function. So we need to first say import in the object. You need to call configure store from Redux toolkit, and from Redux toolkit I'm going to import configure store. And then just out of that, right here I'm going to say constant root reducer is equal to combine reducer. And I'm going to use 2 reducers inside this project. Just to show you how you can use 2 different reducers inside this project, I'm using here combine reducer function and create 2 different reducers. So I can show you how you can manage 2 different reducers inside your React project. So inside this combine reducer function, I'm going to pass here an object and then specify here first reducer, which is questions. And then to these questions, I'm going to specify a function, the reducer function. Right now, I don't have any reducer function yet. So let me just create a reducer for this store. So inside this Redux folder right here, I'm going to create a new file, name this file question reducer.js. And inside this, I'm going to create a reducer function. So I'm just simply going to first say export constant question reducer. And this is a type of function. So I'm just going to specify here a function like this. Just for now, I'm going to leave this as it is. Back to the store. And here I'm going to say, I'm going to first call here a command and say call reducers. And then I'm going to say here import statement. And then I'm going to call here question reducer from the question reducer file. And then specify that question reducer right here. So I'm going to initialize this question property with this question reducer. Just like that, I'm also going to create another reducer inside this project and name this reducer result reducer. I'm going to create a new file for that and say result reducer.js. I'm going to copy this function right from here and specify that right here. And I'm going to name this function result reducer. Save the changes, back to the store, and here I can simply say import, and then I'm going to say here result reducer from the result reducer file. And just down here, I'm going to create another reducer result and then specify this function here result reducer. So this combined reducer function is going to combine both this reducer function and then return that as a central store. Now just for that, let me just specify this reducer to this configure store. So let's create a store. To create a store, let me just create here a command and say create store with reducer. So right down here, I'm going to first say configure store. And inside this, you need to specify the reducer function. So as you know, we have this reducer function inside this variable. So I'm going to specify here an object and say reducer is equal to root reducer. So I'm going to initialize this property with this root reducer. And inside this root reducer, we're going to have two reducers. We combine both this reducer using this combine reducer function and return that to this root reducer. And then we pass this root reducer to the property of this configure store. And then you just need to return this. So you have to say here export default, something like this. But now, before you access your store inside your components, you need to specify initial value to the store. You can initialize your store with the reducers. So if you back to the reducers, here you can initialize your store. To initialize your store, instead of just this function, you return create slides function. So at the top, here you say import and you call this create slides function from the React.js toolkit. And then you specify that to this question reducer right here. So you call this create slides here, something like this, and pass an object. Now using this create slides, you are going to create a reducer with initial value. So let me first specify name to this reducer. So using the name property, I can specify name to this reducer function. I'm going to simply specify here questions. This will specify name to your reducer. And then I'm going to call a property called initial state. So I'm going to pass here colon and pass an object here. Inside this object, I have three properties. First is queue of the type array. Then we have answers of the type array. And then we have trace object with the value 0. Now inside this queue, I'm going to store all my questions. I'm going to get that questions from this database and store that inside this queue variable. Then inside this answers, I'm going to store all my answers array. And then inside this trace variable, I can track the user questions. For example, if I open my root route, click on the start quiz, this is my first question. So inside this trace, I'm going to have 0. When the user click on the next button, I'm going to increase the value of the variable by 1. And after that, we have 1 here. And then right here, instead of 0, I'm going to have my second question. We'll look at that how this works later. Just for now, let's specify the initial value 0 here. And just out of that, you specify here comma, you specify your reducer functions. So you call here reducers and then specify here colon and pass an object. Inside this object, you have your different reducers. Reducer allows you to specify and dispatch an action. The action allows you to change the value of the store. You can only change the value of the store using action. Otherwise, you can't change the value of the store. Using create slides, you don't need to create an action manually. Instead, when you create a reducer function, it will automatically create actions for you. For example, inside this reducer, I'm going to create here a property called start exam action. And this is a type of function. So we pass here a function like this. And to this function, you need to pass two arguments. First is state and second is action. Using this action variable, you can access the value of the user input. And inside the state variable, you have the current state. Now inside this, I'm going to return an object with the current state and then combine it and update the value of this state. So to update the value of the state, I'm going to specify here questions. So I'm going to call here Q and pass your user input value. Right now, I don't have any value here. So let's suppose that if I get the value from the user inside this action property and then specify that to this Q, so I'm simply going to say here action dot payload. Inside this payload property, you get the user input value. When I call this action in the user component, I'm going to pass value to this action payload. And then I'm going to pass that value to this queue and reinitialize this object. Now, because I just specify here a state, is going to create a new property inside the state. So I need to specify here a spread operator. So we need to say here triple dot. Using this, I'm going to update the value of this initial state. So this is going to return the initial state and update the value of this property. And then right down here, you need to say export constant. And from this question reducer, you're going to get actions. So you pass your dot and say here actions. And this is going to return an object. And you can destructure that object inside this variable. So now you can call here start exam action. So using this action, you can dispatch and update the value of the store. And just how that, right down here, we also need to export the reducer. So I'm going to say here export default question reducer dot reducer. And then if I back to the store.js, so instead of putting this inside this curly braces, I'm going to put that outside of this curly braces. Something like this. Something like this. This is because I have this default export from this file. Let me save the changes. My question reducer is now completely ready. Let's see how to access this inside a component. Now, once we have the store, let's start to access this inside a component. So let me open the quiz component and right inside this, let me access this store. So let me first back to my finished website, reload this browser. Here I'm going to have the result from these questions. So if I back to the questions, let me just get rid of this console messages, save the changes, reload the browser, and now back to the quiz. And at the top, right up here at the top, we need to import the state. So to access the state value, you have the React hook called use selector. We get that from the React Redux. So at the top, I'm going to say Redux store import. And right down here, I'm going to import from React Redux. And what I'm going to import is, I'm going to import a hook called use selector. And then I'm going to call this use selector right inside this function, something like this. And from this use selector, I'm going to return the state, the current state. So I'm going to say here state, call here a function, and then return that state. I'm going to get the state in a variable. So I'm simply going to say here constant state is equal to, and then I'm going to call here use effect, the React hook to access this state, and I'm going to call this state here inside console.log. Save the changes and back to the project. You can see I'm going to get here an error message. Could not find React Redux context value. Please ensure that the component is wrapped inside a provider. You'll have this error because you don't have the wrapper function to your index.js file. You have to wrap your app component in the provider of React Redux. So at the top here, I'm going to add a comment, something like this, and say Redux store. So you need to initialize the store. So you have to say here import store from the Redux store, and then you're also going to import provider from React Redux, and then you call that provider right here, something like this. And then don't forget to close it, and you have to wrap your app component in this provider, and to this provider you need to specify your store. So we call here store and then pass this variable, this one, store. Save the changes, back to the project, and you can see I'm going to have this error, reducer result return undefined. This is because this is now return undefined because we don't have any reducer inside this function. So let me just comment this for now, save the changes, and then you can notice this is going to return the current state. You can see inside this current state we're going to have answer, queue, and trace. Now if I want to get this queue right from this function, I need to first access this question. So inside an object I can simply specify here question, something like this, and I can access this question right here, save the changes. It's going to return undefined because the name of the property is questions. You can see I'm going to have an object with answer, queue, and trace. And now I can access this queue using this object. I can simply specify here questions.queue, save the changes, and I'm going to have the initial value of this queue. Now what I want to initialize this queue with questions. So when I click on the start exam, I want to initialize this queue with questions and pass that value to this question component. So let's see how to do it. But before that, let me create my result reducer as well. So I'm going to back to the store, uncomment this statement, back to the result reducer. And as you know, to create a reducer, you need to first import create slice from React.js toolkit, and then specify that create slice right here. And then you specify name to the reducer. So you specify name property, result. Then you specify the initial state, which is going to be the object. And I'm going to specify here user ID. Value of this user ID is null. And then I'm going to specify here result and specify the initial value, add it. We are going to store the user result inside this result variable. So when the users submit their answer, we're going to store all that answer index value inside this array. So just out of this initial value, here I'm going to pass reducers. So we call here reducer property and then pass an object. Inside this, we have different reducer functions. So let's first create a function called set user ID. Now this function allows us to specify, or you can say allows us to set user ID variable. So I'm going to say here state and action. And then I'm going to call here a function, something like this. And inside this, I'm simply going to say state dot user ID is equal to action dot payload. Inside this action dot payload, we're going to pass the value from the user and then pass that to this user ID. So we pass here state dot user ID. And at the end, don't forget to export the action and the reducer. So we first specify here export constant. In the object, we call this set user ID, something like this, from result reducer dot actions. So the result reducer actions is going to return this set user ID action. And we also need to export the default function, which is result reducer dot reducer. So now inside the store, instead of result store, we're simply going to say result store like this, because now from this result file, we have this reducer as a default export. So we specify here result store and then specify that right here. Back to the project, and now you're not going to get any error. But if you're back to the quiz, just get rid of this question. If you specify here state, and then if you try to print this state right here, something like this, you can see I'm going to have two reducers inside this object. We're going to have two reducers here, questions and result. Inside the questions, we're going to have a property called queue, answer, and so on. And inside this result, we have the user ID and result. So we have the single object from the state. Now let's take a look at how you can dispatch an action and initialize questions and get the value of these questions from the store instead of getting this value from this data.js file. Now let's dispatch an action and change the value of the store. And we are going to pass this data in the questions queue property right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to back to the questions, and right here, instead of adding all the code inside this function, I'm going to create a custom hook. Let's create a custom hook inside this React application. So inside the source here, I'm going to create a new folder, name this folder hooks, and then I'm going to create a new file inside it. Name this file fetch question.js. Now inside this file, I'm going to create a custom hook for this application. So at the top right here, let me first add a comment to indicate this is the fetch question hook to fetch API data and set value to the store. Right down here, I'm going to say export constant function use fetch questions is equal to, and then I'm going to specify here a function. Now to inform React that we are using custom hook, we need to specify here use as a prefix. So anytime you want to inform the React that you are using a custom hook, you need to pass here use as a prefix to the function name. Inside this custom hook, I'm going to first call here use state React hook. This will automatically import the use state at the top, and here I'm going to say constant is equal to, in the array I'm going to say get data and set get data. Into the state, I'm going to pass an object. Inside this object, we have three properties. First is loading. The default value of this property is false. Then I'm going to pass API data. The default value is array, and then we pass server error. And the default value of this property is null. Just for that, inside this hook, I'm going to say here use effect. I'm going to call another React hook right inside this hook, something like this. And then inside this, I'm going to update the value of this get data. So what I can do is I'm going to change the value of this loading to true when we are in this use effect. So here I'm going to say set get data inside this function. I'm going to say previous and call a function like this and return a new state. To return a new state, you need to specify here a parenthesis, and inside an object, you specify first the previous state. So you call here a spread operator like this with the previous state. So this will return the previous state. And if you want to update a new value, you need to call the property name with a new value. So we pass here loading, or you can change this to is loading. That's upon you. So I'm going to call here is loading and then specify here value true. So this statement is going to update this use state. And just out of that, right down here, I'm going to call async function to fetch the backend data. Right now, I don't have any backend. So instead of getting this data from the backend, I'm going to get that from the Data.js file. So I'm going to say here import data from this database.js file, and I'm going to get this data and specify that to this API data variable. So I'm simply going to create the async anonymous function. I'm going to call here parenthesis, and inside this I'm going to say async function. So we call here function syntax something like this, and I'm going to call this anonymous function like this by passing here a parenthesis. So this will just call this function. Just for that, I'm going to call here try and catch block. So we call here try and catch. Inside this catch, I'm simply going to say set get data. I'm going to call this function set get data, and inside this I'm going to simply call this statement. So let me just copy this, specify that right here, but this time instead of loading true, we pass here loading false. And then I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to change the value of this server error. So let me copy this, specify that here, and instead of false, we pass this error property. And inside this try, here I'm simply going to say let question is equal to await data. Right now, we don't need to call here await because we just have this data from the .js files. But just for now, I'm going to pass this await because later in this course, I'm going to pass here a fetch function to get the data from the backend. So I'm going to specify here questions, something like this. And then right down here, I'm going to say if question.length, question.length if is greater than 0, then I'm going to execute this if statement. And inside this if, I'm going to say set get data, this function. Let me just copy this statement right from here, specify that here. I'm going to change the value of the loading. So I'm going to say here loading false, duplicate this statement, and change the value of this API data. Right now, we don't have anything inside this API data. So let me copy this, specify that here. And inside this API data, I'm going to pass this questions like this. And at the end, right down here, you need to dispatch an action. The dispatch function allows you to call an action and update the store. At the top, right up here, I need to say constant dispatch is equal to use dispatch. And we get this use dispatch hook from the React Redux module. So I'm going to specify that, something like this. And then right down here, I'm going to call dispatch. And in this dispatch, you specify an action. Right now, we don't have any action inside this file. So we need to first import that. So at the top here, I'm going to call a comment and say Redux actions. And here I'm going to say import star as action from // then specify the Redux folder. And inside that, we have the question reducer. So we get that. And from this question reducer, I'm going to get the actions. So if you open the questions reducer, you are exporting these actions, right? So you can get these actions inside this fetch questions.js file. So using this asterisk, we're going to get all the actions inside this action variable. So right down here, you can simply specify action dot start exam, something like this. And inside this, as you know, you have a payload. If you're back to the question reducer, then you will notice here, we are passing value to this queue from this action property. So we need to pass value to this payload property using this parenthesis. So inside this parenthesis, I'm simply going to pass this question. And then you can call here else statement. If the question.length, if it is less than 0, you can just simply throw here an error message. So you call here throw new error, and inside this you can say no question available. So once we specify value to the initial store, now right down here, don't forget to call here a dispatch function as a dependencies to this use effect. Right to the second argument, you need to specify this dispatch function, something like this. Otherwise, this use effect will continuously loop. If you want to stop the continuous looping of this use effect, you need to pass here dispatch as a dependency to this use effect. Just for that, right from this function, I'm going to return an array of get data and set data, something like this. That's it. The custom hook is now ready to access the value from the store. Let me save the changes, minimize it. Back to the questions at the top, right up here, I need to say here a comment and say custom hook. And I'm going to import this. So I'm going to say here import use fetch question from the hooks fetch question. Specify that right here. And this hook is going to return an array. As you know, you'll get this array from this function. So you can get this array in a variable. So you can simply say here constant. You pass here an array and destructure all the values of this array. So you can simply pass this object. So I'm going to copy this and specify that right here. Don't forget to remove these values because we don't need these values now, because we are getting this value from this use fetch question, something like this. So now you can get all these values from this use fetch question. And as a second index, you can access the set get data, this function. Now because we don't need this right now, I'm going to get rid of it. Inside this use effect right here, I'm simply going to say console.log, and I'm going to copy this is loading, specify that here, duplicate this, specify API data and server error. To understand this, let me just get rid of both these statements right from here and back to the quiz, and let me get rid of this state. Save the changes, back to the questions, reload the browser, and you can see I'm going to have this result. First time, the is loading is going to be false because the React is going to re-render the component. Once we have the data inside a variable, it's going to return true, and after that at the end we return false. If I try to print this second API data, save the changes, reload the browser, then you will notice I'm going to have the initial value as a response, and at the end I'm going to get my data inside this variable. And now if I try to access the quiz state, reload the browser, if I open the questions, then you will notice here in the queue I have all my questions. So this use fetch question is going to initialize and specify value to the store using this function. So we have all the questions inside this queue variable. So now I can access this state anywhere in the component and access all the questions easily. So this function is used to specify value to the store, and it also allows us to specify is loading and is error messages in the component. Now, once we have here is loading, API data and server error variables, I can then return that from these questions. So what I can do is write down here before this return statement, here I can say if is loading is true, then return h3 heading tag with the class name text light with the text is loading. Now that's upon you. You can specify here a component as well. Just for now, I'm going to put here a simple division tag. Then I'm going to duplicate this, and then I'm going to say here if we have error inside the server error variable, I'm going to return that error. So here I'm going to say and specify here server error. If we have object right here inside the server error, I'm simply going to say here unknown error. Now just after that, if you back to the quiz.js, then you will notice here inside this console.log, I'm going to have the initial state of this project. So now what we can do is, instead of getting the data from this data.js file inside this question.js, I can get that from the state. I'm going to copy this statement right from here, and inside this question I'm going to specify that statement, something like this. So I'm simply going to return a state, and inside an object I can specify here questions, copy this question, specify inside this console.log, and now don't forget to import this use selector at the top. So here I'm going to say import use selector from the React Redux, reload the browser, and you can see I'm going to have all the questions inside this queue. So now what I can do is, instead of getting this data from this data.js file, now I can get the questions from this state. I want to get a single question and pass that to this questions variable. Right inside the state, I have all my questions, right? So I get the questions, and inside that question, I have a queue. So if I call here dot queue, save the changes, reload the browser, then you will notice here, this is going to return an array of objects. From this array of objects, I want only one question. So to get the one question from this object, I can simply pass here an array and pass 0 here. Save this and reload the browser. You can see now I can access only one question, and now I can specify this one question to this variable. So we can iterate over that question and pass different options using this map function. So what I can do is, instead of just getting state, I'm going to get all my questions inside a variable. So I'm going to copy this, specify here questions, and then specify here dot questions dot queue, and this is going to return all my array of questions. If I print the questions something like this, I'm going to have the array of objects. So to get the one question from it, I'm simply going to specify here 0. Reload the browser. You can see I can access the first question from this array of objects. But now what I want, when I click on this next button, I want to increase this value by 1. If you back to the questions reducer, then you will notice here I have here a property called threads. I can pass this property right here, so you can access the first question, and when we click on the next button, I can increase the value of this threads and get the second question. So what I can do is, instead of the 0, I'm simply going to specify here state dot questions dot press. So now this is going to return this value 0. Let me show you. If I call this use state again, right down here with just a trace value, copy this, specify that something like this, and if I say constant press is equal to, and if I print this press right here, then you will notice it's going to return 0 as a response. When I click on the next button, I want to increase this value by 1. We will do that later, but just for now, just pass this state question.press right inside this array, so we can access different questions. Inside these questions, right now we have the first question. If you copy and paste these questions here, save the changes, reload the browser, you can see I'm going to have my first question as a response. First time you will get undefined as a response. This is because it will take some time to initialize this state and then return that to this variable. So what we can do is we can only going to access the value of this property when we have that property. So right down here, I can simply pass here a question mark dot a property name. This indicates that we only want to access the property value when we have that property. Otherwise, I don't want to access anything. So what I can do is I can call these questions right here and pass here a question mark. So this will only access the property when we have this property to this object. Otherwise, it will return nothing. This is not going to return any error. You can see we're not going to get any error here. Now I can get rid of this statement right from here and from the top. So now we have the result what I want. Now next what I want, when I click on this next button, I want to move to the next question. So let's see how to do it. Now what I want, when I click on this next button, I want to move to the next question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to update this trace value when I click on the next button, so I can move to the next question. So when I update this value to 1, something like this, back to the question, then you will notice I'm going to have the second question as a response. If I update this value to 2, you can see I'm going to have third question inside my quiz application. I'm simply going to specify the initial value first to this trace variable and then update that value when I click on the update button. So if you're back to the quiz.js, then you will notice here you have this on next update button. You have to update the value of the trace using this button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back to the questions reducer inside this Redux question reducer right here and update this trace value. So for that, we need to create a reducer. So just after this function right down here, I'm going to create a new function. So I'm simply going to say here move next action, and then I'm going to specify a function here, something like this, and then inside this I'm going to say state and action, and just after that from this function I'm going to return a new state. So we first get the previous state using this spread operator, so we pass here state with the spread operator, something like this, and then I'm going to say trace is equal to state dot trace plus 1. If you want, you can get rid of this action property right from here. Because we are not passing any value from the user, we can simply get rid of this action property. I'm going to update this trace value by 1 whenever I call this action, move next action. Let me copy this and specify that right here so you can access this action. Back to the quiz. So let me get rid of all the unwanted files right from here. Now let me first back to the quiz. Right here we have the on next at the top. As you know, using this state you can access the current state. So inside this quiz, let me first comment all the states. Let me comment this use effect, back to the quiz, uncomment this console. You can see I'm going to have the questions. Inside the questions we have this trace variable. To access this you have to specify here questions dot trace. Save the changes, reload the browser, and now we can access this trace variable. And now what I want, when I click on this next button, I want to increase this value. So to increase this value, instead of calling the dispatch function inside quiz component, I'm going to open the hooks, and inside that I have this fetch questions, and right here I can simply call here move action dispatch function. So I'm simply going to say here export constant move next question is equal to, and then pass here a function. And then inside this, you have to call here a try and catch block. So we call here try and catch block. And inside this catch, I'm simply going to console.log a message. If you want, you can return anything right from here. That's upon you. I'm just going to return error message in the console. And just out of that, I want to call here a dispatch function. Now, if you try to call this use dispatch inside this move next question, then you will get an error message. The reason behind this is the use dispatch is a hook, and hook can also be accessible inside a hook. You can't access it inside a function. So if I try to access this use dispatch inside this function, then I will get an error message. The use dispatch is only be accessible inside a hook. But what I want to dispatch an action from this function. To access the dispatch function from this function, you can return another function right from this function and then specify dispatch argument to it. And using that argument, you can dispatch an action. Let me show you how. I'm simply going to say async and call another function. So this function is going to return another function, but with the argument. The argument name is dispatch. And inside this try, we call dispatch. Inside this function, we call the action, this variable, dot move next action. This action, this one, move next action, which allows us to update the value of the trace by 1. So I'm going to call that right inside this fetch question. And then what I can do is I can back to the quiz, and right at the top, we need to first say here use dispatch. So we pass here comma, use dispatch, and then right down here, I'm going to say constant dispatch is equal to use dispatch. And then inside this on next, right here, I'm simply going to say dispatch, this hook. Inside this parenthesis, you need to call this function move next question. And we need to first import that at the top. So right up here, I'm going to say import move next question from the hooks, fetch questions, and then specify this move next questions right here. Now let me add here a command and say update the trace value by 1 using move next action. So now when I click on this on next, I'm going to update the value of the trace by 1. Let me save the changes, back to my project, reload it. And now when I click on this next button, you can see this will update the trace value by 1, and I'm going to have my next question here. I can click on the next button again and update this question. You can see we can easily update the question by clicking on this next button. Now just after that, let me do the same for this previous button. When I click on this previous button, I want to decrease this value by 1. So we can move to the previous question. Inside this fetch question, I'm going to copy this, specify that right here. And this is for previous action dispatch function. And don't forget to change the name as well. And I'm going to change this name to move previous question. And then don't forget to update this action as well. Right now I don't have any action. So inside this questions.reducer, let me just create a new action. So just out of this move action right down here, I'm going to say move previous action. And I'm going to return state from here, from this action. And then I'm going to say return in the object. I'm going to first return the previous state, something like this, and update the value of the state. So we pass here trace. The value of the trace is going to be state dot trace minus 1. So here, using this move next question, we updated the trace value by 1. So we are using the same technique, but this time to this previous button, we are going to decrease the value of the trace by 1. Back to the fetch questions, and we need to update this dispatch function. So we call here action dot move previous question. But right now you can't access this move previous questions because I didn't exported that right from this object. So I need to first export that, something like this. Back to the fetch questions, get rid of this move next question, and instead of that we can pass here move previous. Now this move next action is going to increase the trace value by 1, and this move previous action is going to decrease the trace value by 1. And now I can pass this move previous questions inside this quiz right here inside this on click event handler. So now I can copy this, specify that right down here, and instead of this move next question, now I can pass here move previous questions. So at the top, don't forget to import that first. So right here I'm going to say move previous questions, pass that move previous question right here, and I'm going to say update the trace value by 1 using move previous questions. Reload the browser. Right now I'm on the first question. When I click on the next button, we're going to move to the next question. When I click on the next button again, we are now on the third question. But now when I click on the previous button, you can see we are now on the second question. And now when I click on the previous button again, now we are on the first question again. So now using this next and this previous button, we can navigate through different questions. But now you can notice here, if the trace value is less than -1, I won't get anything right inside these questions. If I try to click on this previous button again, I won't get anything. This is because now the trace value is equal to -1. Now on -1, I don't have any data. What I can do is, in the quiz, I'm simply going to say if the trace value, I'm simply going to update the state with trace, and here I can say if the trace value, if it is greater than 0, then execute this dispatch function. Otherwise, don't want it to execute this dispatch. Back to the project, reload it, and now when I move to the next question, it will return the next question. And now when I click on the previous button, it will move us to the previous question. But now when I click on the previous button again, this will not allow us to move to the previous question, because now in the trace variable we have 0. We are not going to execute the dispatch function when the value of the trace variable is less than 0. And I'm going to do the same for this next question as well. If I click on the next question, and when I'm on the fifth question and click on the next button again, you can see I'm not going to have anything here, because right now on the fifth index, I don't have any data. So what I can do is, right inside this on next, I can simply say if the questions.length of this quiz is greater than the trace, then execute the dispatch function. So what I can do is, right here, I'm going to grab the trace and the queue property of the questions inside a variable. I'm going to duplicate this first, and let me show you what I want to say. Here, I'm going to get rid of these questions and trace, specify that to the state variable like this, display that state variable, reload the browser. Here I'm going to have the questions, and inside that questions, I'm going to have queue and trace. I wanted to access this queue and this trace property inside this variable. So to access this, I'm simply going to destructure it. So I'm going to pass here an object and specify here queue, and then I'm going to get that from the questions. So we pass here dot questions. Let me just comment this, save the changes, copy this, specify that here, reload the browser, and you can see I'm going to have the queue and the trace value inside this variable. So I'm just going to destructure both these properties from these questions. So now what I can do is, right down here, I'm going to say if the trace, if it is less than queue dot length, then execute this if block. And inside this if, I'm going to put this dispatch function. I'm only going to dispatch this action when the trace is less than the queue dot length. Oops, something went wrong. Yeah, right here, as I misspelled the length spelling, reload the browser. And now when I click on the next button, and when I'm on the fifth question, I don't want to execute the dispatch function. So when I click on the next button, you can see it will not call the dispatch function and update the value of the state. When I click on the next button, it's not going to update the trace value. When I'm on the last question of the quiz, I want to finish this examination. Let's see how to do it. Now you can notice when the trace value is equal to 5, I wanted to finish this examination. I'm going to show you how you can do that later in this course, but just for now, let me show you how I can push the user result inside this result reducer. So now what I want, when the user click on any of these options, I want to store the result in the array and then push that array and store that inside a database. If I say here state, if I console.log this state, reload the browser, then you will notice here as a second property, we have a result. Inside this result reducer, I want to specify the user ID and the user result. When the user click on any of this option, I want to store that current option index value inside this result variable, inside this array. So for example, for the first question, let's suppose user select this first option and click on the next button. When the user click on the next button, I want to store 0 right inside this array. If the user select the second option, I want to store 1 inside this array. And when the user click on this third option, I want to store 2 inside this array. So we are going to store the index value of these options inside this result variable. So I'm simply going to open the result.reducer file right here. Inside this reducer, I'm simply going to push a data inside this result variable. Just after this set user ID, right down here, I'm going to create push result action reducer. And I'm going to pass here state and action. And using this function, I'm simply going to say state dot result dot push. I'm going to call a JavaScript function push. So the push method is going to add a new element inside an array. So it's going to append a new element to the end of the array and return a new length of the array. Inside this push, an action dot payload. And don't forget to copy this push result action and then pass that right here. So we can access this action inside a component. Back to the quiz, and right here, I'm going to dispatch that action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function to dispatch an action. So inside this hooks, right here, I'm going to create a new file with the name set result.js. And inside this set result.js, I'm going to say export constant push answer is equal to, and then I'm going to specify here a function. And this function is used to call a dispatch function. So we need to specify here and return another function from this function. And I'm also going to call here async because this is a type of async function. And then I'm going to say here dispatch. And inside this, I'm going to call try and catch block. Inside the catch block, I'm simply going to say console.log and simply going to print this error. And here I'm going to say await dispatch, and I'm going to dispatch an action. Right now, I don't have any action inside this set result. So at the top, I'm going to say import star as action. So using this action object, we can access all the objects of the reducer. So I'm going to say here from single quote // then specify here Redux and then call result reducer.js. And from this result reducer, I can access this set user ID and this push result action. So inside this set result right here, I'm going to say action dot push result action. And as you know, if you back to the result reducer, then you will notice here we are passing a value to this push method using this action dot payload. So we need to pass this value when I call this push result action. So when you call this push result action, you need to pass some value here. You need to pass some value something like 0, 1 or 2. But what I want, instead of passing hard-coded value here, I'm going to get this value from the user. So what if I specify here result argument and then pass that argument right here. So now I can get the value from the user and pass that to this push result action. Let me just save the changes and back to the quiz. Right here at the top, I also need to import a statement, and from this import statement, I need to call this push answer. So right up here, I'm going to say push answer from single quote // specify here hooks. And inside this hook, we have set result. And then I'm going to call this push answer right inside this on next button. So inside this if statement here, I'm simply going to call dispatch push answer. And inside this answer, I need to specify value of the options and pass here 1. back to the project, reload it. And when I click on this next button, you can see it's going to call the on next click button. And when I open this object, you will notice here inside the result, I'm going to have here 1. When I click on the next button again, it's going to store 1 inside the result. You will see. So this will just push a new value inside this result variable when I click on the next button. But what I want, instead of this 1, I wanted to pass this option value inside this push answer and then store that inside a result variable. Let's see how we can get this radio button value and pass that to this push answer. Now, once we understand how we can push data using this push answer dispatch function, let's take a look at how we can store the selected value inside this push answer dispatch function, or you can say inside this result array. So what we need to do is we need to first back to the questions component, right? Inside this question component, I have here on select function. When we select any of this option, I'm going to call this on select. If I uncomment this and back to the quiz, comment this statement, comment this one as well. And now when I reload the browser, you can see I'm going to have your radio button change console message 3 times inside a console. This is because we just call this on select every time when I import this input text box. If I specify here just on select, save the changes, reload the browser, and whenever I choose any option, you can see it's going to call the radio button change console message. You can see I want to get the value of this input type radio button inside this console. So to get that, let me first grab this on select and call here a function, something like this, and again call the on select. But this time we pass here a parenthesis and a value. The value we are getting is from this index variable. So I'm going to pass here an I, and then I'm going to access this I index value right inside this on select. So instead of this console message, right now I can pass that I right here and then access that value right inside this console message, something like this. Reload the browser, and now when I click on the first option, it's going to return 0. When I click on the second option, it's going to return 1. And when I click on the third option, it's going to return true. So we're going to have the result what I want. When the user select the first option, we are going to have 0. When the user select the second option, we are going to have 1. And when the user select on the third option, we're going to have 2 as a response. And now what I want to pass this value to this parent component, to this quiz component. Now, as you know, quiz is a parent component of this question. What I can do is I can simply call here a function with the value check, and inside it I can simply say console.log check, and then I'm going to pass this on check function to this question. So I can access the value of this question right inside this quiz parent application. Right here on check is equal to, and then pass this function, and inside these questions right up here we need to call that on check inside an object. So I'm going to call here an object to destructure this on check property, and then call that on check function right here, and then I'm going to pass that value as a argument. Let me get rid of this console.log right from the questions, save the changes, back to the quiz, and now I can access the value of this quiz, this I variable inside this quiz parent component, inside this check variable. I reload the browser, and now when I click on the first question, I'm going to get 0. On the second, I'm going to get 1. You can notice here on the right side, I'm going to have all these console messages from the quiz.js file. It means from this parent component. So now you can see I can access the value of the child component in the parent one. So now what I can do is at the top, right up here, I'm going to say constant check and set check is equal to use state. I'm going to create a new state with undefined default value, and then call this set check right inside this on check function right here, and then pass value of this check variable, and then I can access this check value using this check variable anytime. I'm going to pass this check variable to this push answer to push a new answer inside a result variable, something like this. When I click on this second option, it's going to return 1, you will notice. And when I click on this next button, you can see I'm going to have this on next click console message. But what I want, instead of this console message, let me just get the result. So I'm going to uncomment this state changes, reload the browser, select the second option, it will return 1. Click on the next button. If I open the result variable, then you will notice now we have 1 here. If I select the third option now and click on the next button, now inside the result variable, I'm going to have 2. And when I click on the first option and click on the next button, I'm going to have 0 inside the result variable. So now you can see we can easily store the user selected values inside this result variable. So it will store all the values now inside the result variable. Now, let's see how we can finish this examination after the last question. So what I can do is, inside this quiz, right down here, inside this quiz, right here, I'm first going to add a comment and say, finished exam after the last question. Right down here, I'm going to say if result.length, I'm going to access this state result property. So to access that, at the top, right up here, I'm going to say state dot result. From this result, you can access another result property. So you can just specify here result, something like this. And inside this state, you're going to have the result variable value. And just out of that, right down here, you can say if result dot length, and result dot length, if it is greater than or equal to press, then I'm going to execute this if block. And inside this if block, I'm going to return a component. I'm going to get this component from the React Router DOM module. So at the top here, I'm going to say import navigate from React Router DOM. So let me just grab this, specify that inside an object, because this is not a default export. So we call here navigate from React Router DOM. So I'm just going to call this component so we can navigate the user to the different location, and I'm going to return that component. And with this component, I need to specify the two property. I want to redirect the user to the result page. So we pass here result. I'm going to say here replace is going to be true. Let me restart this application, start the quiz, select my options. We need to change this condition because whenever we click on the next button, we are going to update the result.length as well as update the value of the trace. So to change this condition, what we can do is we can see here if the queue.length, if it is greater than the result.length, then I'm going to execute this if block. Restart the application, start the quiz, and now you can see when I'm on the last question, it will finish the examination. And inside this result variable, I'm going to have my answers. And now I can check these answers and return a result to this result page. But now you can see when I click on the start quiz, it's going to redirect us to the last result page. This is because we have value inside this result. I want to specify the initial value to this result when we click on the restart button. Otherwise, when I click on the restart, it will move us to the root route. And when I click on the start quiz, it will redirect us to the last result page. I want to reset all the values of the store. So if I back to the store, inside this question reducer, I want to specify the initial value when I click on the restart button. And when I click on the restart button, I want to specify the empty array to this result variable. So it means I want to specify the initial value of the state to the store when I click on the restart button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back to the question reducer right down here. I'm going to create here reset all action and call here a function, something like this, and then return an object. And inside this object, I'm going to pass the initial value. So I'm going to copy this and specify that right here, something like this. I'm going to just specify the initial value when I call this reset all action. Let me copy this and specify that here. Let me do the same for this result reducer as well. So inside this result reducer right here, I'm going to say reset result action, and I'm going to return a function here. And then I'm going to say here an object And inside that object, I'm going to specify this initial value, something like this. And now I wanted to call both these actions right inside the restart button. So I'm going to back to the result.js, and inside this on restart, I'm going to dispatch and call both these actions. So I'm going to back to the result.js, and right here inside the on restart, right here, I'm going to call use dispatch from the React Redux right from this module, and then call here constant dispatch, something like this. And right inside this on restart, I'm going to say dispatch, and inside this dispatch, I'm going to call two actions. So as you know, at the top, let me first import actions. So here I'm going to say reset all action from the question reducer and reset result action from the result reducer. So I'm going to import both these statements right here, and then call this reset all action inside this dispatch, duplicate this statement and call this reset all action right here. Save these changes, back to the project, and now when I click on this restart button, it will reset all the values of the store, and now I can restart my quiz. You can see I can easily restart my quiz. Just for that, what I want, when I select the first option and click on the next button, and now when I click on the previous button, I want this first option to be selected, and we're also going to allow user to update their value. So let's suppose the user decided to update their previous answer, then he can easily move to the previous question and update their answer. So if I click on this first option and click on the next button, you can see I'm going to have here two values inside this result variable. And instead of storing 0 on the next index, I want to update this previous value. So let's see how to do it. Now, just for that, what I want, when the user select their answer and move to the next question and click on the previous button again to check their previous answer, then we need to show the previous answer of the user and allow user to update their answer. If the trace variable value is less than the result.length, then we are going to allow the user to update their value. Let me show you in detail in the example. Right now, we have three values inside this result variable. Let me reload the browser and show you the result again. Inside this result, right now we don't have any value. But if I select this first option and click on the next button, it's going to store 0 here. But now when I click on the previous button, I wanted to show the user their previous answer. So I want to select this first option because we have 0 here. If I try to change this answer, let's suppose if the first answer is selected, and if the user try to select any of this answer, I wanted to update this first index of this result array. Let's see how to do it. Inside this result reducer, just after this push result action, right here, I'm going to say update result action. And then I'm going to specify here state and action. So we get the value from the user. Just out of that, what I want to do is I want to use fill JavaScript method to update the value of the result. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get the user trace value and the check value and then update this result array. Here I'm going to say constant in the object. I'm going to get trace value and the checked value, and I'm going to get this value from the action dot payload, and I'm going to say here state dot result dot fill. Now this fill method is going to change all array elements from start to end index to the static value and return a modified array. It means using this method, I'm going to specify where I want to update the value of the result variable. Using this trace variable, I'm going to get the index, and using this check variable, I'm going to update that value with this check value. So let's suppose user selected this first option, and inside this result, we have 0. So when the user click on the previous button and back to the previous question, inside this trace variable, we are going to have 0. And we are going to pass that 0 to this fill and update the 0 index value with this new one. Inside this check, we have the new value. Whenever I click and change the value of this option, I'm going to pass that value to this check and update the value of the previous index. So now here inside this field, let me first pass check the updated value, and as a second argument, we need to specify the index. I want to update the index of trace. And we also can specify the end number. So we can just simply specify here trace plus 1. This is going to update the current index. Let me save this. Don't forget to copy this update result. Specify that here. Something like this. Save this. Back to the questions. And right here, you need to first call use dispatch and say constant dispatch is equal to, and then inside this use effect right here, I'm simply going to say dispatch, and then I'm going to call the update result. So here I'm going to say update result action. So I'm going to call this update result action from the result reducer. As you know, we need to pass trace and the check value. Right inside these questions, we already have this check value. Right here, I'm going to say constant trace is equal to use selector, and from the selector, I'm going to return state and say state dot questions, and then this is going to return the trace value. Copy this and then specify that right here as an object. So we pass here an object and pass trace value and the check value. And what you have to do is, don't forget to call this set check right down here with this I value. So when we call this on select, whenever I check or update this radio button, I'm going to pass that value to this check and then pass that value to this update result. And don't forget to call this dispatch as a second argument to this use effect. Otherwise, it will continuously loop. Reload the browser, select the first option, click on the next button, it will store 0. When I click on the previous button, try to update this value and click on this last option. Click on the next button again. Now this is not going to update the first index. But you need to notice here one thing. Whenever I click on this next button, it's going to insert a new value inside this array. Instead, what I want, when we are on the previous question, I don't want to insert any value inside this result array. So what we can do is, we can back to the question right here. You will notice here, we're going to insert a new answer inside this array when we click on the next button. But here, we need to only execute this dispatch function when we want to insert a new value in the array. Otherwise, I don't want to call this push answer. So to add this condition, I'm simply going to say here if result dot length, if it is less than or equal to trace, then I'm going to insert a new value inside an array. Reload the browser, select the first option, click on the next button, click on the previous button, back to the previous question, update this value, and click on the next button again. You can see now it's not going to insert a new value inside this array. But now I want to update this first option when we click on this next button. So now I can say here a command. You can say insert a new result in the array. Let me save the changes. Back to the questions right here. I need to first check in the console.log. I need to check this trace value. So let me copy this, specify that here, get rid of this dispatch right from here. Back to the project and reload it. You can see when I select the first question, click on the next button, it's going to store 0 inside this result array, and inside this trace we have 1 and check is going to be 0. Click on the previous button to move to the previous answer. And now if you want to update this answer, you can just click on this option. When you click on the option, you will notice here the result will get updated. So let's suppose if I click on this third option, you can see if I click on this second option, I'm going to have 1 inside this array. And when I click on this first option, I'm going to have 0 inside this result array. And when I click on the next button and click on the next button again, you can see I'm going to have 0 and 1 inside this result array. If I back to the previous question again, update the previous answer is 1. So if I now change this to 2, when I select this last option, you can see it will update this array and I'm going to have 2 as a response. Now instead of calling this use update action right inside these questions, I wanted to call that inside this set result. So right here, I'm going to say export constant update result is equal to, and then I'm going to call here index and value, means the check value, and then I'm going to return again the async function with dispatch, and right from this function I'm going to return try and catch block. Just return the console.log message with error, and inside this try block I'm going to say dispatch call action dot update result action, and to this update result action you need to specify value to this reducer function right here. So what you can do is you can just simply call here index and pass the check value, or you can just simply pass here index value. Just after that you have to just save the changes, copy this update result back to the questions. Right up here you have to say update result and call this hook, and then copy this update result. You have to import this update result inside these questions and get rid of this update result action and replace that with update result function. Get rid of this statement. If you want, you can pass here a comma and pass the check variable as well as a dependency. Reload the browser, select the first option, back to the previous question and select the second one. You're going to have the same result. You can notice here. Now, just after that, let me get rid of this console.log right from here. When we are on the first question, I don't want it to display this previous button, because if you click on it, you're not going to get anything. Because right now we are on the first question. We don't have any previous question now. I want this previous question only when I have the previous question. Otherwise, I don't want to display anything here. I only want this previous button when we have the previous question. So what I can do is I'm going to back to the quiz right down here to this previous button. I'm going to grab this previous button, and then here I'm going to call an object and then say if press is greater than 0, then and only then execute this if statement. Otherwise, you don't want to execute anything and you don't want to return anything. You can see I'm going to have the result something like this, but I wanted to move this next question on the right side. So now I can simply return a div right from this statement. When we are on the first question, we don't have the previous button, but if I select the first question and move to the next one, you can see we're going to have the previous button again. Now let me just check this complete application. I selected the first option of the first question. Let me select the second question answer, this one. We have the result what I want. Then select the third question answer. Select the fourth question answer. Let me update this third question answer. Click on the back and click on the previous button again. And now I wanted to change my answer and select this second option. So I need to update the 0 by 1. I click on this undefined. You can see this will update this third answer and I'm going to have undefined as a response. But now what I wanted to show the user their answers. So what I can do is we can back to the questions and right down here, as you know, when I call here a check class, this is going to select all the answers. When we have the user selected answer, we can toggle this class and show the user selected answers. I'm going to grab this check right from here, put that inside a template string, and then I'm going to say here dollar in the curly braces. I'm going to say result. Because I don't have result inside this question, let me just grab the result from this state. Here I'm going to duplicate this use selector on here result dot result, and I'm going to get that inside a variable called result. Right down inside this class names, I'm going to say result of press. If it is equal to the I value, means if it is equal to this index, then return check, otherwise return nothing. To the browser, select the first option, click on the next, back to the previous option. Then you can notice I'm going to have here my first selected option. Let's suppose if I click on the next button, select this last option, click on the next button again, and now when I click on the previous button again, you can see I'm going to have my previous answer. And if I click on the previous button again, I'm going to have my first answer. So this will just show me my selected answers. If I wanted to update this, I'm simply going to change this value. So if I click on this last option, you can see this is going to select both these values. To solve this problem, when we click on the check, when we click on this on select, I want to call this a dispatch function. So we call that dispatch function right here. And now, if I select any of these options, I can easily update that. You can see. That's super easy, right? And now let me get rid of this console messages right from here. Save this file. And now at the end, let me just select the last question and click on the next button. You can see now I'm going to have my array of results. I'm going to have the user result inside this array. And now I can compare this array with the correct answers. And now I can compare these user selected answers with the correct answers and then display the quiz result. Let's see how to do it. Now, as you can see, when we have the user selected options inside an array, I also need to call the answer array inside the store. So if I back to the question reducer, then you will notice here, I just have a questions here. I need to also initialize this answer array. Right from this action, I'm going to call and initialize this queue and answer at the same time. So here I'm going to say let in the object, I'm going to call questions and answers. And I'm going to get that from actions.payload. And just out of that, here I'm going to say questions, if I hear comma, and say answers. If you want, you can specify the answer something like this, or you just need to specify this answer. Both statements are identical. Let me just save the changes. And now when you call this start exam, inside this fetch question, if I open the fetch question, and inside that you can notice we need to specify here an object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just back to the database, and inside this data.js right down here, I'm going to export a constant answer variable is equal to, and then I'm going to specify an array of answers. So this is the right answers of all these questions. So I'm going to store that inside a variable and return from this data.js file. Save the changes, back to the fetch questions right here. And as you know, we're getting this data from this data.js file. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get the question as well as the answers. To get the answers from this data, what you have to do is you have to just back to the fetch questions right up here. You need to pass a comma here, and in the object, you need to pass these answers. And then you need to pass that right here. Something like this as an object. So inside an object, you pass questions and answers. And just out of that, you have to copy this right from here and then specify that to this dispatch action right here. Something like this. Something like this. And then save the changes. And don't forget to change these property values. So let me copy these property values back to the questions, and in the reducer, don't forget to specify here question instead of questions, right? Let me save the changes. Just out of that, what I want to finish this exam and store all the user result inside the result variable and display all the user information. So now if you try to print the console.log with the state, then you will notice here inside this, you're going to have an answer array, right? And now you can compare your user selected answers with these correct answers. So let's see how to do it inside the result component. So I'm going to back to the result component. Let me close all these files and now open the result.js. Right here at the top, right up here, I need to first call use selector from React Redux. And from this use selector, I'm going to return state. And I'm going to destructure all the value of the state inside a variable. So here I'm going to say constant is equal to, and inside an object, I'm going to destructure all the values. So as you know, we have questions, and inside that questions, we have queue and answers. And just out of these questions, we have result. And inside this result, we have result and user ID. So I'm going to destructure all the values inside this constant variable, and now you can access the properties of the state inside this result variable. You can do the same for all these options as well. That's upon you. Just for that, right down here, let me just call here use effect, something like this. If I print the result right here, and now I'm going to back to the quiz, get rid of this use effect right from here, reload the browser, select the options. You can see on the result page, you're going to have the user selected results. You want to get this array, compare that with the answer array we have inside this result variable, and then display the user result. Right down here, just after this use effect, right here, I'm going to say constant total points. To calculate the total points, we need q dot length, and we divide it by 10. So each question has 10 points. So I'm going to calculate that and store that inside a total points variable. Just after that, I'm going to say constant attempts, and to get the user attempts, I'm going to call here a function called attempts number, and I'm going to call that function from the helper function. I'm going to back to my project right here, and inside the source, I'm going to create a new folder, name this folder helper, and inside this helper folder, I'm going to create a new file, helper.js, and inside this, I'm simply going to say export function attempts number. Now, because this function is going to return number, that is why I specify here name number. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this function. And to this function, I'm going to pass an argument result. So here I'm going to say return if the result dot filter. Then I'm going to return the result, and I'm going to say if the r means the user value, if it is not equal to undefined, then return the length of the array. So we call here length, something like this, and return from this attempts. Let's suppose if I start the quiz and fill all the questions, but I forgot to specify answer to this third question and move to the next one. Select the answer of the fourth question and move to the next one, and finish this exam by clicking on this next button. You can notice this array shows us that we selected all the answers. What I want, if I forget to specify any answer, I'm going to specify undefined instead of 0 and 1. So I'm going to back to the component, open the quiz, and right after this statement right here, I'm going to reset the value of the check variable. So here I'm simply going to say set check is going to be undefined. Back to the project, restart it, and let's suppose if I select the first question, second one, I don't know the answer of this question, click on the next, answer this question, and don't know the answer of this last question, click on the next button. You can see now I'm going to have undefined inside this array index. So now I can say user attempt only 3 questions. So to filter this array, I'm using this helper function. Now this result dot filter, if the array is not equal to undefined, then this is going to return 3 from this function. So now I can copy these attempt numbers back to the result at the top. Right up here, I can say import attempts number, copy these attempt numbers, specify that right here, and pass the result variable. And now inside these attempts, I'm going to have my result. You can see I'm going to have 3 inside these attempts. Now just for that, I also wanted to count the earn points. Here I'm going to say constant earn points is equal to, and I'm going to call here a function. The function name is earn points, and I'm going to get this function from this helper function right from here. So we pass here export function earn points number, and this function is going to take 2 arguments. First is the result variable, and second is the answer variable. I'm going to return here result.map. I'm going to iterate over the result, and here I'm going to say element and index. I'm going to get each array one by one, and here I'm going to say if the answers of I. If it is equal to the element, then return that. Let me just show you the result of this statement. Let me copy this back to the result, specify that here, and we need to specify here result and answer. And let me just copy these endpoints and specify that inside these attempts. Oops, I need to first import this, copy this at the top. I'm going to import this right up here. And you can see I'm going to have this result. We have true, true, false, true, and false. I'm going to filter this array and return only true values. So I'm simply going to say here dot filter inside this helper.js file and return only true values. So to return only true values, I just need to filter and return the index value. So now this is going to filter the array and return only true values. Now once I have the true values, I can then specify points to the user. So to do that, I'm going to call here dot map, then call here I, and then return 10. So for each correct answer, I'm going to return 10 points. This is now going to return 10, 10, 10 for each correct answer, right? And just out of that, I'm going to call reduce function to sum this array. So I'm going to say here reduce and then specify here previous and the current array. And then I'm going to return here previous plus current. And as a second argument, you don't forget to specify here 0. Otherwise, you will get an error message. So now you can see you are going to have 30 as a response. So it will just sum this array and return a response back. So this is your earn points from this quiz. Let me reload it. Answer of this question is 0. So I'm going to select the 0. The answer of this question is second, this one, console.log. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to select this one. And then I'm going to select the wrong answer now, return object. And then I'm going to leave this question as it is and click on the next button. You can see I'm just going to have 30 points. This is because I answered only 3 questions correctly. Let me restart it and do the same thing, but this time I'm only going to answer 1 question. So let's suppose if I select this first one, select the wrong answer, also going to select the wrong answer, leave this question as it is, and select here a wrong answer. You can see I'm just going to have a 10 points because I attempt 4 questions but have only 1 correct answer. You can just call here points as a parameter and then you can pass that point right here. And then when you call these earn points, you can just then simply call here points. So 10 points for each correct answer. Now just out of that, I'm going to create here constant flag is equal to, and then I wanted to check that the user is pass or fail. For that, I'm using here a function. The function name is flag result. And here we're going to pass 2 parameters. First is total points and second is earn points. And from this total and from this earn points, I can specify pass or fail flag to the user. So what I need to do is I need to first copy this flag result, import that first, save this file back to the helper. Here I'm going to say export function flag result, something like this. And here we have 2 values. So I'm going to specify here total points and earn points. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say here return if the total points multiply by 50 divided by 100 is less than the earn points. Then return true or false. So the parameter to pass this exam is if your marks is less than 50%, you're fail. So I'm going to save the changes back to the result. And here I'm going to copy this flag, specify that here, save the changes. I'm going to get false as a response. This is because I have only 10 points. So the result is fail. So what I can do is I can just specify that flag right down here. I'm simply going to say here an object, then pass here flag, question mark, and say pass or fail. And then I'm going to change the color as well using this flag. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass here style, and inside an object, I'm going to say color, colon, then I'm going to call here template string, call dollar object, and here I'm going to say flag. If it is true, then return the green color, otherwise return the red color. You can see I'm going to have fail with the color red. So if you're fail, then you will get red color, and if you're pass, you will get green color. And let me change these values as well here. So this total earn points, instead of this 50, I'm going to say here total points, or the default value is 0. Then I'm going to get rid of this total questions, and I'm going to say here q dot length. So this is the total question length of this quiz. And then I need to specify here total attempts. So in the object, I'm going to say attempts or 0 as a default value. Total earn points is going to be the variable. So I'm going to call here earn points, or specify the default value 0 to start the quiz. And now let me just start the quiz again. Let me now first select correct answers. 0 is the correct answer for the first question, 1 is the correct answer for the second question, and 3 is the correct answer for the third question. Now I'm going to leave this question as it is and move to the next one. And now I'm going to click the wrong answer here. So I'm going to select this pass one. Click on next. You can see I'm going to get true because I have 30 points. I attempted only 4 questions. The total questions is 5 and the total points are 50. So from the 50, I got 30 points and the result is now passed. Now I can store these values inside a database and display them right here inside this table. But now at the end, what I only want Authorize User to access this quiz. If the user forget to specify their username inside this user text box and click on the start button, then I don't want anyone to join this quiz. Instead of using this input text box, if you want, you can use here a login page as well. That's up on you. Just for understanding how we can restrict the user and only allow the authorized user to access the quiz, I'm using this input text box. So let's see how to do it. Now, let's take a look at how you can allow only the authorized user to access this quiz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back to the reducer. So I'm going to open this result reducer, and right inside it, you can notice here I have set user ID. I'm using this set user ID action to set the user. So I'm going to back to the main.js right here. And when I click on this start button, I'm going to call here onClick event. I'm going to say here onClick, and then I'm going to call here an event called start quiz. Let me copy this and then create that right up here. Here I'm going to say function start quiz, something like this. And then here I'm going to say if we have input reference dot current, and if we have value inside this input text box, only then I'm going to execute a dispatch function. So at the top, let me first call use dispatch from React Redux, and then here I'm going to say constant dispatch is equal to, and right inside it I'm going to call dispatch, and inside this dispatch, as I said, I need to call this set user ID. So inside this main, I'm going to say set user ID from Redux reducer, and then I'm going to call this function here, something like this. And then to this set user ID here, I'm going to pass this input current user value. So if we have value here inside this input text box, only then we're going to authorize the user. Otherwise, we won't allow user to take the quiz. So if you back to the result.reducer, then you will notice here, I'm using here action.payload to set the new user ID. So when we specify value here inside this set user ID, then this is going to set a new user and specify the value to this user ID variable. Save the changes, reload the browser, specify the user ID. Let's suppose if I specify here user ID daily, click on the start quiz. If I try to access the current store, if I say here use selector state console.log state, save the changes, then you will notice here inside this user ID, I'm going to have this value. When I have value inside this state, only then I'm going to allow user to access the quiz. So I need to make the restricted routes. So to make the restricted routes, I'm going to back the helper function right here. And inside this helper function, right down here, I'm going to create a command and say check user auth. and right down here, I'm going to say export function. The function name is check user exist, and then I'm going to pass here children's, and then from this check user exist, I'm going to say constant auth is equal to if the use selector, I'm going to call here use selector from React Redux, I'm going to get and access the state, and then I'm going to say here state if state dot result dot user id. If this is going to return the value inside this auth, then return children's. Otherwise, navigate the user to the different location. So we call here navigate React router DOM component. So I'm going to press enter and import this navigate right at the top. And here I'm going to close this navigate. And we're going to navigate the user to the root route. So we pass here / something like this. And I'm also going to say here replace true. And what you have to do is you have to call this check user existence inside app.js right here to protect your routes. So at the top here you have to say check user existence. You have to import this function and wrap this function to this component. So at the top right here, I'm going to say check existence and grab your component quiz, specify that here, so close it and do the same for this result. So I'm going to say here check existence, specify that here, something like this, copy this result and put that inside this check existence. So this will just protect both these routes. And now if I try to click on the start quiz, this is not going to start the quiz until you specify something inside this input text box. If you want, you can create a login form and authorize the user as well. That's upon you. I'm just going to use here input text box. So when the user specify their ID, let's suppose if I specify here tuition and click on the start button, only then I can access this route. Let's suppose if I reload the browser and if I try to access quiz route, then you will notice this won't allow me to access the quiz route. If I try to access the result route, I can't access that if I don't have the user ID. So this is how you can secure your application from unauthorized user. Next, we're going to build an API using MongoDB database and display all the data and access this database using API. Now, once you understand how to make this beautiful React application and pass all the data from this data.js file, let's take a look at how you can pass all this data from the backend. So instead of data.js file, I'm going to create backend using Node and MongoDB and pass all that data using API. So to create a backend, we need to just open this server folder inside the terminal. So I'm going to open my terminal, enter into my project directory. I'm in the quiz app. So I'm going to select the quiz app and then select the server folder. When I press enter, now we are in the server folder. Now let me first initialize this folder as npm package. So we need to say here npm init. And then I'm going to skip all the questions. So I'm going to pass -y. This is going to initialize this package as node package. Just after that, let me clear the screen. And now we need to install few libraries to create a backend server. So to install libraries, we are using npm I for install and then specify the library's name. First, I'm going to install Express, which is the node framework used to create HTTP requests. Then I'm going to install Course for sharing data between different domains. And then I'm going to install .env. The .env allows us to create environment variable. Just after that, I'm going to install Mongoose, which is used to connect Express server with MongoDB. And then I'm going to install Morgan. Morgan library allows us to log every request inside a console. And then at the end, I'm going to install NodeMon. NodeMon allows us to restart the server every time when we make changes in the app. I'm going to install all this library for this backend and press enter. So this is going to install all these libraries inside the node modules folder. So now once we have all these libraries, let me just clear the screen, close this terminal, and inside the server, I'm going to create a new file in the root directory. And here I'm going to say server.js. So this is the main file for this backend. So I'm going to create server.js. And here I'm going to initialize this app and create different HTTP requests. So we need to first initialize this app. So to initialize the app, we need to first import Express from Express. Now, if you try to use import inside a server, you're going to get an error message because Node used CommonJS to import libraries. For example, if you want to import Express library inside this file, you have to say constant Express is equal to, and then call the require function. And inside that, you need to specify the file path. So this is the CommonJS format to import files inside the Node.js application. But what I want, instead of using this CommonJS format, I want to use the import syntax. So for that, I need to back to the package.json file, and just out of this main right here, I'm going to specify here a type, and this is a type of module instead of CommonJS. Now I want to import modules with the modules format. So I'm going to pass here modules, save this file back to the server, and now here I can easily say import Express from Express. So now I can use this import statement inside this server. Just out of that, we need to initialize this app. So I'm going to say constant app is equal to Express. So I'm going to call this Express. So this is going to initialize this app. And just out of that, once we initialize this app, right down here, we can create different routes. So to create routes using Express, we can simply say here routes and then specify here app dot get. So this will just make a get request, and then I'm going to make this get request on the root route, and then I'm going to pass here the controller, or you can say the callback function. So if you make a request to this root route, I'm going to execute this callback function with request and response parameter. So inside this, I'm going to call try and catch block. Inside this catch, I'm going to say response.json and return this error message. And inside this try block, response.json, and then I'm going to say here get request. Just out of that, once we have the request, once we have the HTTP get request, right down here, we need to start the development server. Right down here, I'm going to say app.listen. And I wanted to listen this app on the port 8080. So I'm going to pass here 8080 and then specify the callback function here. So I'm going to pass here a callback function, something like this, and then say console.log. Single quote, I'm going to say server connected to HTTP colon / localhost colon, and then specify your port name, which is 8080. So now using this console.log message, you can easily open your server. So now let me save the changes and start my development server. So what I have to do is I have to save this file back to the package.json. Right down here, you have the script to execute your application. So instead of this test, I'm going to say here start and say node-mon server.js. Using node-mon, I don't need to restart the server every time when I make changes inside the .js file. Let me save this file and open my terminal. Here I need to say npm start. I just need to execute this start command. So I'm going to say npm start. When I press enter, this is going to start the server, and you're going to have this message: server connected to HTTP localhost 8080. And now if you try to open this inside a browser, you will notice here you have a get request here. So now this is a very simple technique to create a server. What I want now, I want to add some features inside this application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first import Morgan. Whenever I make a request using this server, I want to get that request right inside this console. So at the top, I'm going to say import Morgan from the Morgan library, and right down here, I'm going to create a comment here and say app middleware. And right down here, I'm going to say app.use, and I want to use Morgan. So I'm going to pass here Morgan, and inside this, I'm going to pass format. So let me just specify tiny format here, specify semicolon, save the changes. When you open your terminal, you will see the node-mon will automatically restart the server whenever you make changes inside the server.js file. Now just out of that, when you reload your browser and back to your project, you can see you have your request console message right inside this terminal. Now Morgan is optional for this application. If you want, you can get rid of this Morgan library from this app. Now just out of that, we also need to import course. So I'm going to say import course from course library. Now course is used for cross-domain data sharing. So what I'm going to do is just after this Morgan, here I'm going to say app.use and say here course. Now just out of that, we need to inform Express that we are using JSON format. So what we need to do is right down here, we need to say app.use and specify here Express.json. Just out of that, when you scroll down, you will notice here I have here hard-coded value here for the port. Instead of specifying this hard-coded value, I'm going to store this value in the .env file. So when you deploy your application, you can easily specify your port using environment variable. So at the top, right here, I need to import .env. So from the .env, I'm going to call config, the config function. And just after this, right down here, you just need to call here config, something like this. So this is going to initialize this app with .env. So what you have to do is, at the last, you need to create .env file so you can store your port variable inside it. So right down here inside your server, in the root directory, you have to create .env file. Inside this file, you store your global variables. We usually create here global variables in the capital letters. So we pass here port is equal to, and then specify value to it. Now, I'm going to specify here 5000. It means I wanted to start this application on the 5000 port. Save this file back to the server. Right down here, just out of this config, here, I'm going to add a comment and say application port. And then I'm going to say constant port is equal to, and then to get the value of this .env file, to get the variable name, you have to say process.env dot the port name. You have variable name port. So you specify that port name here. And if we don't have this variable inside this .env file, then I wanted to start this server on the port 8080. So this is the default port I'm going to specify to this application. So I'm going to copy this port variable and then specify that right here. And let me do the same right here as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all this text, get rid of this single quote, pass here template string, specify the text again, and get rid of this hard-coded port, specify here $. In the curly braces, I'm going to specify now port. So now let me save the changes, open my terminal, and you can see now my application is running on localhost 5000. Now, once we understand how to create this route and create this Express application, let me just initialize this server as a Git repository so you can follow along with me from any section of this backend. So I'm going to open the terminal, open a new terminal, enter into my project directory. So I'm going to say cd, quiz app, and server. And right here, I'm going to say git init. So this will initialize this package, this server folder as a Git repository. Now, once we initialize it, I need to add all these files inside a Git. So I'm going to say git add and add all the files. But before we add all the files, I need to ignore few files and folders from this server file. So what I have to do is I have to ignore this node modules and this .env. So I'm going to just create this file git ignore. So right inside this server in the root directory, right here, I'm going to say .git ignore. And inside this file, if you open the client git ignore file, then you will notice here we have some code here. This file is going to skip this node modules folder and the .env files. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to skip the node modules folder. So I'm going to copy this, and in the server file, I'm going to open the server file, and right here I'm going to pass node modules. And I save the changes. You can see now the git ignored this node modules folder, as well as I also want to ignore .env file. So I'm going to say .env, save the changes. You can see this will ignore .env file as well. That's it. Just out of that, once I ignore both these files, now let me add all this inside a Git repository. So I'm going to say git add and press dot to add all the files inside a Git repository. Just out of that, I'm going to say git commit -m and specify a message here. And I'm going to say starter file. And I press enter. This will add all the files in the Git repository. And now you can follow along with me from any section of this project. Now, just out of that, once we add all the files inside the master branch, I'm going to say here git checkout -b to create and check out inside a branch. And I'm going to name this branch routes and specify 01. When I press enter, this will allows me to enter into the routes 01 branch. And now if you want to follow along with me from this section, you have to just enter into this routes branch. Now let's create different routes. You can see here inside this application, I just have one route here. one route with get request. Instead of just one route, I want to create multiple routes and create an API. So to make an API inside this Express application, let me just create a new folder inside the server, and I'm going to name the folder router. And inside this router folder, I'm going to have a file called route.js. And inside this route.js, I have all the API routes of this project. Right here, I'm going to create few routes for this project. So to create routes inside this separate dedicated file, you need to import a router module. So inside it, you need to say import. In the object, you have to say router from Express. As you know, inside the server.js file, to create a route, you just use the app.getHTTP-request. But inside route.js, you have to import a router module. Just after that, once you import the router module, right down here, I'm going to create a command and say questions routes. So now I'm going to create different routes for the question API. But before we make any routes here, right down here, I'm going to just back to the server.js, and I'm going to use this file right inside this server. So to use this file, just after this command right down here, I'm going to say app.use, and then I want to specify here my routes. At the top, I need to first say import, then specify here router from the router file. But right now, I don't have any export statement here. So that is why this is not going to get any route from this file. So what I'm going to do is, at the top, I'm going to say constant router is equal to, and I'm going to initialize this with a router module. So I'm going to pass this function here. So now this router is now used to export routes from this file. So right down here, I can say export default router. And now I can use this router in my server.js. So let me save this back to the server.js. And here I'm simply going to say import router from router.route file. And I'm going to use this router right here. But what I want, I need to specify here a path. So as a first argument, I'm simply going to specify here a single quote, and then specify here /, and then specify here comma, and then specify the router. Now, all the routes we are about to create inside this route.js file belongs to this root path, but I don't want to do that. I already have a root path get request here. So everything we are going to create inside this route is all about an API. Let me just add here a command and say APIs. So what I'm going to do is, here I'm going to add API endpoint. So anytime you wanted to access your API, you have to specify API endpoint and then your route path. So let me just save the changes back to the route, and here I'm going to create API. So we first create the question route API. So to make the question route API, I'm simply going to first say here router dot get. This is going to make a get request, and then specify here single quote, specify path. So I'm going to say here questions, and then specify the controller here. So I'm going to pass here comma and specify here request and response parameter. And inside this, I'm simply going to say response.json and say questions API get request. Back to the server, save this as well. And now instead of opening browser every time when we want to make a request to the server, we are going to use VS Code extension to make a request. So what we need to do is, we need to back to the extension tab of your VS Code right here and search for Thunder Client extension. So we search for Thunder Client. Here you can see you have this Thunder Client extension. Just open it and install this extension in your VS Code. Using this extension, we can make different requests to the API. Now you can see I already installed Thunder Client extension in the VS Code. So on the left side right here, you can see we have this icon here of Thunder Client. So let me open it, close this extension. I already have some activities on this Thunder Client. To make a new request, you have to click on this new request. This will open a new window, and here you can specify your URL and make a request. You can make a request and select your HTTP type using this drop down menu. Now we are making a get request, so we select here get, and we are on the localhost 5000. So I'm going to specify that URL right here. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to specify this URL right inside this Thunder Client get request. If I back to the server.js, when I scroll up and open my terminal, then you'll notice here I have here an error message. This is because Node.js won't recognize the file without an extension. So you need to pass .js, the file extension, every time when you add import statement inside your backend. So the server is now connected to the localhost 5000. So let me copy this and then specify that right here inside this new request. And we are making a GET request. And when I click on this send, you can see I'm going to have here my message. Now I'm going to have this response from this root route. What I want to make a request on this questions route. So to make a GET request to this questions route, I have to back to the new request right here. And now you can see in this activity tab, you have here your previous request. What I want to make request to this questions route. So I'm going to open a new request, and here I'm going to specify / and then specify questions. But now when you make a request on this route, you're not going to get anything, because if you back to the server.js, you have here an endpoint to access your all routes using API endpoint. So inside this new request, don't forget to first pass API and then specify / and then specify your endpoints. So I'm going to specify questions and click on this send button. You can see this is going to make a GET request, and I'm going to have the response what I want. Now just out of that, once you understand how you can make a GET request, you can do the same for all the requests right from this drop down menu. We'll look at that later. Just for now, close both these tabs, back to the Explorer right here, and open the route.js file. And here I'm going to make my different HTTP request. Now in this file, we might have more than one HTTP request inside this route.js file. So instead of creating this controller inside this route.js file, let me just separate this controller from this file. We can easily manage it. So inside the server right here, I'm going to create a new folder, name this folder controller, and inside this controller, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to name that file controller.js. And inside this controller.js file, I'm going to put the controller of this route. Let me just change name for this folder. I'm going to say here controllers instead of controller. So inside these controllers, and right here, I'm going to create all these controllers. So to create a controller inside this file, I'm simply going to say here export async function and then specify the function name. Now because we have here inline function, we don't need to specify any name to it. But if you create a controller, you need to specify name to the function. So this is a GET request, right? So inside a controller right here, I'm going to say get questions and then specify here request and response parameter. So we pass here request and response. And from this, as you know, we're going to say response.json and return a response. Let me just save this. And inside this route.js right up here, I'm going to say import controllers. So right here, I'm going to say import controllers from / specify controllers controller.js file. So don't forget to specify the .js extension as well after this file. And inside this controller, I'm going to have all my functions. But what I want to get all my functions. So here I'm going to say asterisk as controller. So this is going to create an object, and using this object, I can access all my functions inside this file. So instead of this function right here, I can simply say controller dot, and you can see I can access the get questions function now. So I'm going to specify that function here. When I save the changes, if I open my Thunder client by clicking on this extension tab, and when I make a request to this API questions, you can see I'm going to get the same response. And if I open the terminal, you can see I'm going to have the get request on the API questions. I'm going to have this console message from the Morgan library. Now once we have this response, we can create controllers inside this file. So let me first create a different routes here. So this is a get route. Let me create a post route as well. I'm going to say here router.post and then specify the route path. So I'm going to say here questions and then pass here comma and then specify the controller. So let me back to the controller. I'm going to add here a comment and say insert all questions. And for this first controller, I'm going to specify a comment and say get all questions. Right down here, I'm going to create export async function with the function name insert questions. And I'm going to pass here request and response parameter. And then here I'm going to say response.json and then specify here a simple text. So I'm going to say here questions API post request. I'm going to send a simple response from this insert question function. Let me just access this insert question right inside this route. I'm going to say here controller dot insert questions. Now when I make a post request on this route, I'm going to have this response. Save this file as well. Back to the Thunder client. Let me just make a new request. Let me copy this URL, create a new request, and here I'm going to specify that URL, and this time instead of get request I'm going to say post request. When I click on the send button, oops, I think I misspelled something. Yeah, I just forgot to add here /. Back to the new request, and now when I click on the send button, you can see I'm going to have the response what I want. Just out of that, let me close this. Back to the route, and now you can see here for the same route endpoint, I'm actually writing this unnecessary code. What I can do is I can use chaining to create this HTTP request. I'm simply going to call here, right down here, I'm going to say router dot route. I'm going to call router dot route function, and to this route function you specify your endpoint. I'm going to specify here single quote / and then specify questions endpoint, this one. Because we are using the same endpoint for get, post and delete request, I'm using this technique. So I'm going to say here questions, and I'm going to change all my HTTP requests. So to change all the requests just out of this route, I'm going to say dot get, and here you just need to specify your controller. So I'm going to copy this get controller right from here and specify that here. And I can change another HTTP request right here. I can say here dot post and then specify my post HTTP controller here inside this parenthesis. I can simply copy and specify my post controller here. That's super easy, right? So I don't need to add this statement. Now let me just enter here something like this. So this is the get request and this is the post request. Now just for that I also need delete request as well to delete all the questions. So inside this controller, let me first create here a command and say delete all questions. Right down here I'm going to export a synchronous function, and the function name is drop questions. And don't forget to pass your request and response parameter, and then you specify here response.json and then specify here questions API delete request. Back to the route, and here just after this post right down here I can say dot delete, and then I'm going to say controller dot drop questions, something like this. And this is for delete request, right? Save these changes. Back to the Thunder client, create a new request, and here I'm going to specify my endpoint, and here I'm going to specify my endpoint. So let me copy this endpoint, specify that here in the new request, and then I'm going to specify the delete request. So I'm just going to change this HTTP request to delete. I have the same endpoint for get, post and delete. So I'm not going to change this endpoint. Just for that I'm going to select this delete to make a delete request and click on this send button. You can see I'm going to have this message question API delete request. So this is going to successfully make a delete request. So inside this backend I'm going to have two routes, one for the questions and second for the result. So I'm going to create here a new route. So I'm going to say here router dot route, and I'm going to make endpoint call result, and using this result endpoint I'm going to store all the user data inside a MongoDB database. So I'm going to make here three requests. First is get. So let me create a controller for this. So inside this controller file right here, let me just create a new controller for get all result, and I'm going to say here export async function. The function name is get result. Don't forget to pass request and response parameter. And then I'm going to return a response. I'm going to copy this, specify that here. And this is for result. So I'm going to say here, result API get request. Just out of that, let me save this back to the route. And here I'm simply going to say controller dot get result. Just down here, I'm going to say dot post, and then I'm going to create a controller for that. So inside a controller right here, I'm going to create a controller for the post all result. And then I'm going to say export async function. Specify name to this function, which is store result, or you can say insert result, that's upon you, and pass request and response parameter. And right down here, I'm simply going to return this response. So I'm going to copy and paste this response here. And this is a type of post request. So we pass here request API post request. And let me do the same for the delete as well. I'm going to say here delete all result. And right down here, I'm going to say export asynchronous function. The function name is drop result with request and response parameter. And then I'm going to paste the response, something like this. And then I'm going to say here result delete API request. Save the changes, back to the route. And here I'm going to say controller dot store result. Just out of that, I'm going to say dot delete. And for this delete, I'm going to specify controller dot drop result. Open a new request. This time I'm going to copy this URL back to the new request, specify the same URL here, but instead of questions, now we have result endpoint. So I'm going to say here result. So I'm going to use this endpoint right here, and let me make a get request first. If I make a get request, you can see I'm going to have this response result API get request. If I make a post request on the same endpoint, I'm going to have the same response. And if I make a delete request, I'm going to have this response result API delete request. And now if you open your terminal, you're going to have the console.log message with different response. So now we successfully created all the routes for this application. Now let's make all these controllers one by one to store all this data inside a database. So what we need to do is we need to connect this application to the MongoDB so we can store all the data, and then we're going to use all this controller to store all the data inside a MongoDB database. So let's see how to connect MongoDB first. So now, once we understand how to create all the controllers for this application, let's take a look at how we can connect this app to the MongoDB database. Inside this server, right here, I'm going to create a new folder, name this folder database. And inside this database folder, I'm going to create a file connection.js. So I'm just going to say here con.js. Inside this file, I'm going to add first the import statement and import Mongos from the Mongos module. Mongos module allows us to connect this Express application with the MongoDB database. We have to export a default function. The function name is connect. So we first see here async function, and the function name is connect. And right from this function, you're going to call mongos.connect. You call this method connect and pass your URL here. Now, right now, I don't have any URL to specify here. Now, we are not using a local MongoDB database to specify the URL here. Instead, we are using the MongoDB Cloud Atlas and specify the Cloud Atlas URL here so we can access the MongoDB database and store the data. So I'm simply going to first open a new tab and search your MongoDB. Click on the mongodb.com and sign up with your Google account. Once you've done that, MongoDB will open the MongoDB Cloud Database. Right now, I already have here a cluster and the existing project. To create a new project, you can just head on right here on the top left corner and click on this View All Projects. Right now, I already have one project inside this MongoDB database. You can notice here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project. Click on the New Project button and then specify the project name here. I'm going to specify project name, quiz, app, and then click on this Next button. This is going to create a new project. So if you want to add a new members or set some permission, you can specify that here. Otherwise, you can leave everything as it is, as default, and click on this Create Project. When you click on it, this is going to create a new project inside the MongoDB Cloud Database. Once you have your project, on the top left corner, you have this quiz app. And now let's create and build a new database. You have to create and click on this build a database button. You have three options here: serverless, dedicated, and share. Share is the free version of MongoDB. Just choose that and click on this create button. This will just open the window something like this. Then I'm going to leave everything as it is, and then I'm going to change the cluster name. If you want, you can leave this name as it is, but for this example, I'm going to name this cluster quiz. And I'm going to click on this create cluster button to create a new cluster. This is going to create a new cluster and allows us to create MongoDB database inside the cloud. So I'm going to leave everything as it is right here and back to the database. It will take some time to create this cluster. Now, just for that, you have to back to the database access, and here you have to add your user. So click on this add new user database, specify their username and password. I'm going to choose a simple username admin, and password is admin123. I'm simply going to choose this password and this username for this database so we can easily access this database. And then click on this add user. This is going to add this user so we can access this database, and then click on this network access. Now here you have to add your IP address. So click on this add IP address, and then you have to click on this add current IP address. I don't want it to show my IP address, so I'm just going to say here allow access from anywhere. Click on confirm, and this is going to allows me to access this database from any device. After a few seconds, I'm going to have here active status. So now this IP address is now active to access this database. Just after that, back to the database access. Here you have your user, and if you back to the database, you have your cluster here. Now you can create a new database and create collections inside it. So just click on this browse collections, and inside this you can search for your collections. Right now you don't have any collections here, so just back to the database again and create a new collection using Express. So what we have to do is we have to connect this cluster to the Express application. For that, click on this connect, and from here you have to copy the connection string. So just click on this second option, connect your application. Here you can find your connection string. So just copy it by clicking on this button. Once you copy it, close this tab, back to the database, and here you have to paste that link. And just for that, you have to change this password. As you know, we have the username admin and the password is admin123. So you have to get rid of this password right from here and specify your password here, admin123. This is going to allow us to connect this application with MongoDB database. But what I want to do is I want to store this link in the .env file instead of storing this right here. So I'm going to cut this link right from here back to the .env, and here I'm going to create a new variable. The variable name is Atlas URI, and then I'm going to specify here equal to sign, and in the double quote I'm going to specify the MongoDB URL here. Close this .env. Now to access this variable, what you have to do is you have to just specify here process.env dot the variable name, which is Atlas URL. Just specify that variable name right here, and now you have the access to the MongoDB database. Just for that, don't forget to specify here await to make this code asynchronous, and then say here console.log, and I'm simply going to specify here in the double quote database connected. That's it. Let me save this file, and you have to call this file inside the server. So in the server.js right here at the top, I'm going to say connect import connection file, and I'm simply going to say here import connect from database.connection.js file, and you have to call this function right inside this server file. So right down here before this route, right up here, I'm going to call my connections. Save the changes. When I open my terminal, you can see I'm going to have this message database connected. So now you are successfully connected to the MongoDB database. But what I want, instead of this connect function, I only wanted to start this backend server when we have the valid connection. Otherwise, I don't want to start this backend. Let me just add here a command and say start server only when we have valid connection. So right down here, I'm simply going to say connect this function. Let me get rid of this right from here, and then I'm going to say connect dot then I'm using here promise, and then call the callback function here. And just out of that, I'm called here catch to catch the promise, and say here error if you have any error in this project. So inside this catch, I'm simply going to say console.log. In the double quote, I'm going to say invalid database connection. And just up here inside this connect, I'm simply going to grab this statement and put that right inside this connect. So here I'm going to say try and catch block, and inside this try, I'm going to put my app, and inside this catch block, I'm going to say console.log, and in the double quote, I'm going to say cannot connect to the server. I'm just going to simply console.log the error message, and I'm going to start the server only when we have a valid connection. So inside this try, I'm going to put this app.listen, specify the port name, and leave everything as it is. And I'm going to have the same result, but we have the database connected message first, and then we have this server connected message. It means we first check for the connection and then start the server. So if we have the valid connection, only then we can access the backend server. Otherwise, I don't want to start my backend server. Now, once we have that, let me just create collections inside this MongoDB database using MongoDB schema. Now, once we have the valid MongoDB connection, now we can create different collections and store the data inside it. So what we need to do is we need to define structure for the document using MongoDB schema. We need to create models so we can specify structure to the document and store all the data according to that structure. So if you're back to the MongoDB database, then you will notice here when you click on this browse collection, right now you don't have any collection here. So let's create a collection and specify first the structure for it. So inside this server folder right here, I'm going to create a new folder, name this folder models, and inside this folder, I'm going to create the MongoDB schema. And here I'm going to create two files. First, for the questions, so I'm going to say here question schema.js. And I'm also going to create another file here and name this file result schema.js. So inside this project, we have two modules. First for the question and second for the result. So we use question module to store all the questions and answers, and then we use result module to store all the user data. So let me first create the question module. Back to the question.schema, and here I'm going to say import mongoose from the mongoose module, and right from mongoose you have to import schema class. So you have to say here constant. In the object, you specify schema from mongoose. So you destructure that schema object right from mongoose, something like this. And then right down here, I'm going to create a comment here and say question model. So to create this model, you have to say constant question model. I'm going to create a variable question model is equal to, and then create a new schema. So we specify here new schema, and inside this parenthesis, inside curly braces, we specify the structure for this question model. So to specify this structure, I'm simply going to create here a property called questions. Now this field is going to represent all the questions. So we create here a field questions, and then we specify type to it. This field is a type of array, so we pass here type, and this is a type of array, as I said. So we pass here array, then we pass comma here and specify the default value to it. So we pass here default array. So the default value of these questions is array. Inside these questions, I'm going to store all my questions of this quiz. Just after that, I'm going to specify and create here another field with the name answers. And inside this answer, we are also going to store an array. So we first specify type of it. So we specify type, and this is also a type of array. So we pass here an array and then specify the default value to it. The default value is an empty array. And at the end, I'm going to create created add property, or you can say created add field, and then I'm going to specify type to it. The type of data I'm storing inside this created add is a type of date. We are storing date inside this property, and then I'm going to specify default value to it, which is date dot now. We're going to store the current date inside this created add field. Just like that, once you have this model, when we specify structure to it, we need to specify name to it. So to specify name to it, I'm simply going to say here export constant questions is equal to, and then I'm going to specify here mongoose dot model, and inside this you specify name to this model. I'm going to specify name here to this model questions, and then I'm going to specify structure to it. I already have this structure variable here, question model. I'm going to specify that as a second argument. So we specify the schema, this model. So MongoDB is going to create this question collection inside the MongoDB database with this structure. Let me just capitalize this queue back to the result schema.js. And right here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to create a new schema. So I'm going to copy both this import statement, specify that here. Right down here, I'm going to create a new comment and say here result model. To create a result model, you have to say here constant result model is equal to create a new schema. So we pass here new schema and we specify here curly braces. Inside an object, you specify different fields to this model. So I'm going to first store the username. So we create here a field username and then we specify type to it. The type of data we are storing inside this field is a type of string. So we pass here type string. After that, I'm going to store result. So we create here a property called result, and this is a type of array. So we pass here type array, and the default value is going to be empty array. Just out of that, I'm going to create here attempt field, and this is a type of number. So we pass here number, and the default value is 0. Then I'm going to specify here points, create a new field here, points, then specify type of it, and this is also a type of number, and we specify default value to it. The default value is 0. And just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say achieved, and I'm going to store here pass and failed result. So I'm going to say here type, and this is a type of string, and then I'm going to specify here default value, which is empty string, something like this. And at the end, I'm going to say here created add property, and then I'm going to specify here type of it, which is a type of date, and we specify default value to it, which is date dot now. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say export default mongoose dot model, and then I'm going to export this model. So I'm going to first specify name to it. The name of this model is a result, and then I'm going to specify structure for it. So we specify this schema here. So we pass that schema as a second argument, something like this. So now this is going to export this result model. Let me do the same for this question model as well. Let me save this back to the question model, and here I can simply say export default and then export this mongoose model back to the result. Save this file as well, and now I can create a new collection inside my controller. So let's see how to create that. Now, just out of that, once you have your question and result collection, let me show you how you can insert data inside your MongoDB database and create a new collection inside it. So we are going to back to the controller.js, and right here, I'm going to access this question and this result schema. So at the top, right up here, I'm going to say import question schema from models question schema .js. Don't forget to specify the extension as well. And then instead of this question schema, I'm simply going to say here questions. Now because we have the default export from this file, I can specify any name to this variable. Just for that, I'm going to say import result schema from the result file, and I'm going to specify variable name here, result. Just for that, let me just use and get all the data from the questions collection. So instead of this response.json right here, I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to specify here questions, and here I'm going to call try and catch block first. Inside the catch, I'm simply going to say response.json, and in the object, I'm going to return error message. And inside the try block, I'm simply going to say questions, this schema dot find. This find method allows us to find all the documents inside a collection and return that as a response. Right now, I return all the collections, so I'm going to specify just a parenthesis and call this find method. And I'm going to get this data inside a variable. So I'm going to say constant q. That's upon you can specify any name to this variable. And because we have the asynchronous function, I can use here await to make all the data asynchronous. Just out of that, I'm simply going to say here response.json, and then I'm going to pass this question variable, this one right here. Let me save the changes and test this GET request. I'm going to open the Thunderbolt client, make a GET request. So I'm going to select the GET request. So I'm going to select the GET request and select the endpoint questions, make a GET request. And when I click on the send button, I'm going to get this error. The reason behind this is I'm going to get this error because I don't have the authorized user. So if you back to your MongoDB database and click on this database access, then you will notice here you don't have any role to your MongoDB client. So what you have to do is when you create a database access user, you need to specify database client role. So to specify that, you have to click on this edit and scroll down, and here you have the built-in role. So just select this option and select the role. Right now, I'm going to select the Atlas admin. I'm going to specify all the role for this user. So I'm going to specify here Atlas admin and click on this update user. When I click on update, it will take some time to update this database. So now once the MongoDB Atlas update this result successfully, we can now make the same request. So let me just make the same request. When I make a GET request, you can see I'm going to get the status 200 and we have the empty array as a response. This is because I don't have any collection inside my MongoDB database. So if I back to the database and click on browse collection, then you will notice here I don't have any collection inside this MongoDB. So to create a MongoDB collection, you have to insert some data inside it. So just back to the controller, and right down here you have this controller insert questions. Right here you can insert data inside your MongoDB questions. Let me get rid of this response. Here I'm going to call try and catch block. In the catch, I'm going to say response.json, and in the object we pass error, and in the try I'm going to say questions MongoDB schema dot insert many. Now because I wanted to insert multiple documents at the same time, I'm using here insert many method, and inside this I need to specify document. So what I have to do is, as you can notice here, we have this question field and this answer field. I don't need to specify any data to this created add field because we already have this default value to it, and I'm using this default value every time when I create a new data inside this database. So I don't need to specify any data to this created add. So what we need to do is we need to just specify value to the answer and questions. So to specify value to it, inside this controller, right inside this insert many, as a first argument here, we specify an object, then we specify questions and specify value to it. Let's suppose if I specify value here array and pass 0 here, and then specify the second property answer and specify an empty array and pass 1 here. So I'm going to pass these two fields right inside this controller and insert both these fields inside a MongoDB database. And just out of that, here I'm going to pass comma to pass the second argument and then specify here a function. This function is going to have error as a first argument and data as a second argument. And using this function, I can simply say response.json. In this JSON, I'm simply going to specify message data saved successfully. Let me save the changes. Back to the Thunderbolt client, open the post request. So let me just select the same endpoint and make a post request. So I'm going to select the post, and when I click on the send button, you can see I'm going to have this message data saved successfully. And now if you back to your MongoDB database and click on this refresh button, then you will notice here you're going to have here two collections. First is questions and second is result. Right inside these questions, you're going to have your first document. Right now I just imported a default data inside this document. Let me delete this document and insert all my questions and answers. Let me delete this. Now just out of that, inside these questions, I'm going to insert all my data. So to insert data, I'm going to back to the controller, and as you know, inside my clients, inside this Data.js, I have all the data of this project. I'm going to copy this, close this file, close the client, and inside the server, inside this database folder right here, I'm going to create a new file, Data.js, and put all that data here. Save this file, minimize this database, minimize this model, and open the controller.js. And right at the top here, I'm going to import both this data. So I'm going to say here import questions, and in the object, I'm going to import answers. And I'm going to get this from // specify database and specify data.js file. I'm going to get this data from this file and specify that to this insert question right here. So instead of this 0, now I'm going to pass these questions, and instead of this answer 1, I'm going to pass these answers here. Or you can also get rid of these properties, something like this. Both statements are identical. Just for that, let me save those changes back to the post request. And now when I click on this send button, it's going to make a post request and store all this data inside my MongoDB database. So I'm going to just back to the database, refresh it, click on the collections, and you can see I'm going to have all my data here inside an object. I'm going to have all my data inside this MongoDB database. Now to get this data, I'm just going to back to the questions endpoint, make a GET request, and click on this send button. You can see I have my data inside my MongoDB database. So now using this MongoDB GET request API endpoint, I can get all my questions as a response. Now you can see inside this MongoDB, you're going to get ID to uniquely identify your data and all your questions. Let me show you how you can drop this data. So if you back to the controller and when you scroll down here, we have this drop questions. So right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say try and catch. I'm going to call try and catch block. Just simply going to say here response.json, and in the object we pass error. And then in the try block right here, I'm going to say questions dot delete many. And using this delete many, I'm going to delete all the data of the MongoDB document. And then I'm going to say here await, something like this, and just simply going to return a response. So I'm going to say response.json in the object, in the message, and in this MSG, I'm going to say questions deleted successfully, something like this. Let me save these changes back to the Thunderbolt client. Now instead of this get, I'm going to make now delete request on this same endpoint, on the questions endpoint. When I click on the send button, you can see this will delete all the data from the MongoDB database. And if I make the get request again on the same endpoint, I'm not going to get anything because this is going to delete all the data from the backend. And if you want to insert this data again, you have to make a post request on these questions and make a post request. So this is going to store all the data. And if you back to the get request, you will have all your data in your MongoDB database. You can notice. Now let's do the same thing for the result schema. Let me show you how you can store the result inside a MongoDB database. Now, once you understand how you can make question collections inside a MongoDB database, let me show you how you can make the result collection. Inside this result collection, I'm going to store all the user result data in the MongoDB database. So I'm going to back to the controller and let me minimize all this controller. And right down here, you can see we have these get all result controllers. So I'm going to first get all the results. So I'm going to open the get result controller and I'm going to say here try and catch block. Inside this catch, simply going to say response.json and return an object with error. And then inside this try, I'm going to say constant r is equal to await results dot find. The find method is going to find all the data and return as a response. Now I'm going to say here result. I'm going to get this schema right from this file and get all the data inside this R variable. Just after that, I'm going to response that R variable. So I'm going to say response.json and return that data. Let me do the same for the store. Let me get rid of this response.json. Here I'm going to say try and catch block. And inside this catch, simply going to say response.json, return object with error. And inside this try, instead of passing data from the .js file, I'm going to get the data from the user. As you notice here, at the top, inside these insert questions, I'm going to get this data from the data.js file. But now what I want to get the data from the user and store that in the MongoDB database. So for that, I'm using here request.body object. So I'm going to say request.body And when the user pass data with the post request, I'm going to get that data inside this body object and destructure it. So I'm going to say here constant. In the object, I'm going to destructure all that data. So the user need to specify JSON data with different properties. And I'm going to destructure all that properties right inside this object. I'm going to say here username, result, temps, points, and achieved. I'm going to get all this data from the user and store that in the MongoDB database. Down here, I'm also going to say if I don't have a username and if I don't have result. If I don't have any data in both these variables, then I'm going to throw an error. So I'm going to say throw error. I'm going to return a new error object. Inside this error, I'm going to say data not provided. Just like that, if we have data, then right down here, I'm going to say results. So I'm going to say results right down here and then say dot create. This time I'm going to call here a method create because I only want to insert one document in the MongoDB database. If I need to insert multiple documents, I'm going to use this method insert many. But right now I want to insert only one document. So I'm going to use here a method called create, and to this method I'm going to pass all this data. So I'm going to copy this object and pass that right here. I'm going to store all this data inside this result schema. Make sure you have the same properties to your result model. Otherwise, you will get an error message. Make sure the properties are exactly same. Just like that, as a second argument, I'm going to specify function. In the function, you will get error and data. And inside this function, you can simply specify response.json and then specify here a message, msg. Inside this, I'm going to say result saved successfully. Save this file, scroll down, and let's create this drop result as well. So let me add here try and catch block, something like this. Inside this catch, I'm going to say response.json and say in the object error. Inside this try block, I'm going to say await results dot delete many. This will delete all the data from the result, and then I'm going to say response.json, and in the object I'm going to say msg result deleted successfully. Save this file, and now let me just test all these routes. We have to back to the Thunderbolt client, open the GET request, and this time I'm going to make a GET request on result. When I make a GET request on result, I'm not going to get anything because we don't have any data inside it. So let me just insert some data inside this result variable. As you know, if you back to the controller, you are going to get this data from the user. So when you make a post request now to this result endpoint, when you make a post request, make sure you pass data with this post request. Otherwise, you will get an error message. So I'm going to select post, make a post request on this result endpoint, and then I'm going to select this body. And right inside this body, inside this JSON, I'm going to pass this object. And now I'm going to pass data to all these fields. This username, don't forget to specify here double quote to convert this data into JSON format. Then I'm going to pass here colon and then specify the username. For example, if I specify here daily, let me convert all this data into JSON format. Now, once you convert all this data into JSON format, let me specify some values to it. Inside this result, as you know, you're going to store an array. So make sure you pass here an array. And inside this array, I'm just going to specify 1, 2, and 3. Inside this attempts, you're going to store number. Inside this point, you have number. And inside this achieve, you have string value. So I'm going to specify here number 2. This became 3. And inside this achieve, I'm going to specify string value, which is passed. Now, just like that, once we have this data, now we can make a post request. When I click on send, you can see I'm going to have this message, results saved successfully. And now if I back to make a GET request, when I click on send, you can see I'm going to have this data. I'm going to have this data inside a MongoDB database. And now if you back to your MongoDB database and click on this result, you can see you're going to have all this data inside your MongoDB. Now let me show you how you can drop this data. If you make a delete request on the same endpoint, this will delete all this data. If I make a delete request on the same endpoint, you can see I'm going to have this message result deleted successfully. And if I make a GET request again, I'm not going to get anything because this will delete all the data from the MongoDB database. Now what I want to use all these API endpoints and store all the data of my front end inside my MongoDB database. So let's see how to do it. Now, as you can see, once you have your backend ready, you have two endpoints. First is questions and second is result. Using both these endpoints, you can work with your front end. Using questions, you can store all the questions inside your MongoDB database. And using result, you can store the user data inside the result collection. So once you have both these endpoints, or you can say once you have the API, now you can make a request and store all your front end data inside the backend. Let's see how you can do that. Let me close all these files of backend and open my front end. If I make a GET request on questions, you will notice here, when I make a GET request on questions, I'm going to have all questions as a response, right? Now, what if I'm back to the client, open the source folder, right inside this helper function right here. If I create a new function to get the data from the backend, let me create here a comment first and then say get server data. And if I say here export async function get server data, then I can get all the data of the backend using this function. So what I'm going to do is at the top, I'm going to import a library called Express, which we already installed in the React application. If you're back to the package.json, here you can notice we already have this Express library. So I'm going to use that library to make a GET request. So I'm going to say import Express from Express. Using this library, we're going to make a GET request. So to make a GET request, you have to say here await Express dot get. And right here inside this get method, you have to specify your get method URL. So this is going to make a GET request. Right now, I don't have any URL. So right inside this get server, I'm going to pass here a parameter called URL and pass that right here. So I'm just going to create here a pure function to make a GET request. And just for that, this is going to return an object. And inside that object, you're going to have all the details of the request. If I just say here constant data is equal to, and I'm going to say console.log data. And let me just call this right here, get server data, something like this with URL. So if you back to the Thunderbolt client right here, see you have this endpoint, just copy it, pass that here to make a GET request. And now when I save the changes, let me just back to my client folder. So I'm going to say quiz app cd client folder, and I'm going to just specify here npm start. This is going to start the React application on the local host 3000. So let me just inspect this, open the console. Right inside this console, you can see you're going to have this data. You're going to have this console message from this statement right from here. If you reload your browser, right inside this object, you're going to have this data property. What we are going to do is we are going to access this data property to get the data from the backend. To get that data, then simply cut this and put that inside a parenthesis, something like this. And then before this parenthesis, I need to say await. And after this parenthesis, I can call here dot data. Using this technique, I can access the data property of this object. Now, just for that, I also need to specify here a question mark because I only want to access this data property if we have it. Once we store that inside this data variable, I can return that. But instead of just returning that data, I can also call here a callback function. So I can just pass here a comma and say here callback. So if the user wanted to access this data using callback, he can do that with callback or with just a variable. So here I'm going to say return. If the user specify callback function, then return that callback with this data variable. Otherwise, just return the data variable. Now, once we have this pure function, let me do the same. Let me create the same function for post request. So I'm going to say here post server data. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this function, specify that right down here. And this time, instead of get, I'm going to make a post request. And make sure you pass some data with the post request. So we pass here result, something like this. And then we pass that result as a second argument to this post request. So we're simply going to pass here a comma and say result. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this parameter. Once we have both these pure functions, now we can make a get and post request to the backend. Now, once we have both these functions to get and post the data of a backend, let me just get the backend data and specify that to the front end. So what we're going to do is I'm going to back to the client. And as you know, inside this hook, I'm going to have here a file called fetch questions. This fetch questions is going to allow us to fetch the question and specify that to the component. So here, what we need to do is, as you can notice here, this statement is going to get the data from the Data.js file. Instead of getting this data from the JS file, I'm going to get this data from the backend. So what I can do is, right down here, I'm simply going to say here await, and then call here my function, this one, get server data. So I'm going to call that here. So I'm going to say here get server data. When I press enter, this will automatically import that function at the top. You will notice here, this will import that function from the helper.js file. And when I specify that here, and now I need to specify the URL. Now what I'm going to do is, to specify URL, I'm simply going to copy this URL right from here and then specify that right inside this parenthesis. But what if you change this URL when you deploy your application? In that case, you have to manually update this data. So to solve this problem, I'm going to create a .env file in the root directory of this client. I'm going to create here a new file, name this file .env, something like this. And then I'm going to ignore this file. So I'm just going to specify here .env, save this, close this git ignore. And inside this .env, I'm going to create the React environment variable. To create a React environment variable, you need to start the React variable name with React app. So you specify here React app and then specify your variable name. I'm going to specify variable name here, server host name, and then specify equal to sign. And in the double quote, I'm going to specify HTTP localhost 5000. So this is my domain. Save the changes. Let me just restart my React application again so the React can easily access the .env file. Just out of that, let me close this .env, back to the fetch functions, and instead of this hard-coded value, now I can simply specify my environment variable here. So let me pass here a template string in the dollar, in the curly braces, I'm going to say process.env dot react app server hostname. And then I'm going to specify here / specify the endpoint API, and inside that I have questions endpoint. So I'm going to specify that URL here. And then I'm going to just call my callback function, something like this, with data variable, and then return that data. Just out of that, I'm going to store this in a variable. I'm going to say here constant q is equal to, and then if I console.log this, something like this. Oops, I think I misspelled something. If I back to my helper.js, yeah, I just have the same name to both these functions. And this is for post server data. Reload it. Let me specify the username. Start the quiz. When I start the quiz, you will notice here inside this array, I'm going to have this data. I have this answer, created add property, and the question. I'm going to have this data from the backend, right? Now what I want to get these questions and these answers from this object. So to get that, I'm going to back to the fetch questions, and right here, I'm going to first call an array. This is because we have this response in the array. So we call here an array. Inside this array, I'm going to destructure this object, answer property, and the question property. So here I'm going to specify an object and say questions and answers. And let me just print both these objects right inside this console. Back to the project, and you can see right down here, I'm going to have my questions and answers. And now I can specify both this data of the backend to this questions. What I can do is I can pass this data right here, something like this. And instead of these questions, I just need to specify here questions, get rid of this statement. I don't want to get this data from the data.js file right now. Get rid of this file as well. Back to the project, and you can see we have this question is not defined right here. I need to change this to questions. Save this, reload the browser, and now when I specify the username, click on start question. Oops, I think I misspelled something. Yeah, right here. Now because in the Redux, I imported question from this payload, and in the fetch question, I'm passing here questions. That is why I'm going to get this undefined error. I can simply specify here question and pass this data. I get all my questions from the backend. Now I'm not using this Data.js file to get the backend data. So now I can delete this database folder. So I'm going to just right click here and delete this database folder right from this client. Just out of that, what I want to do is I want to store all the user data inside the result. Now just out of that, what I want to store all the user data in the MongoDB database when the user finish the exam. So let's suppose if the user finish this exam, we will redirect to the result endpoint. What I wanted to store all this data of the user in the MongoDB database. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to back to set result. Right here, I'm going to create a new function to store all the user data. So if you back to the components, open the result, then you will notice here in these variables, I have all the user data. What I can do is if right down here, if I say console.log, in the object, if I print a result, username, then specify value to it, user ID, this one, then I'm going to pass here a comma, and then specify the attempts, specify comma here, pass points, and specify value here on points. Just out of that, I'm going to specify here achieve and pass value to it. So I'm going to pass here flag, and if the flag is true, I'm going to return pass, otherwise return fail. So now if I console.log this data back to the project, then you will notice here I can store this data in my result collection. So if I'm back to my server, then you will notice inside these modules, need username, result, attempts, points, achieve. I can store all this data inside this result collection. So to insert that, I'm using this helper function, this one, post server data. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open the hooks, open the set result, and here I'm going to create a custom hook. This custom hook allows us to insert the data inside the MongoDB database. So right down here, I'm going to say insert user data, and right inside it, I'm going to say export constant and create a hook called use publish result is equal to, and then I'm going to store the user result. I'm using this custom hook to store the user data inside the MongoDB result collection. So what I'm going to do is right here, I'm going to first check if we have the proper data inside this use publish result. So I'm going to get this data from the parameter. Here I'm going to say result data, and I'm going to destructure result and username. So I'm going to say constant destructure result and username from this result data, and here I'm going to call the async anonymous function. So I'm going to say parenthesis async and call the asynchronous function here. Let me just call that function something like this, and then right inside this function I'm going to call try and catch block. So I'm going to call try and catch, and right inside this catch simply going to console.log error, and inside this try I'm going to first say if the result, if it is not equal to an empty array, and if we don't have the username, then throw error. So I'm going to say throw new error, and I'm going to specify here error message couldn't get result. And if we have both this data inside these variables, then I can simply specify here await server data. I'm going to just call here post server data helper function from the helper file. You can notice I'm going to import that, and right inside this I'm going to say post server data, and then I'm going to pass here the URL. So in the template string, pass here $. In the object we specify process dot env dot react server hostname. So I'm going to specify that right here, and just out of that we need to store this data inside API result endpoint. So we pass here / API result. And then as a second argument, you need to specify your data. So we pass here result data, this variable. And then I'm going to return this data. So we pass here data and return that. Let me save the changes and use this use publish result hook inside this component, inside this result component right here. Right down here, I'm going to create a comment and say store user result. And right here, I'm going to call use publish result. I'm going to call this hook, and then inside this parenthesis, you just need to specify the user data. So I'm going to copy this complete object right from here and then specify that, something like this. So now we have all the data what we wanted. And if you open your result, then you will see you're going to have your front-end data inside your database. So now this is going to store all your data inside your MongoDB database. If you want to get your data, you can just make a GET request. If you say GET result, if you make a GET request on result, you can see you're going to have all your data here. This random username, your result, attempts, points, and achieve. If I back to my React application, restart this quiz, this time I'm going to remove all these console messages. So I'm going to back to the result and quiz and remove these console messages. Get rid of the console message I have here. So get rid of this use effect. I'm not using it. And back to the quiz and get rid of the console message right from here as well. Restart the quiz. And now let me specify the username, daily tuition. Now let me first delete this first document. Back to my React app, specify daily tuition username, click on start quiz. You can notice it's going to store all this data in the MongoDB database. Let me show you. If I back to the MongoDB database, refresh it, I'm going to have all this data in the MongoDB database. I'm going to have the username, attempts, points, and so on. So if I make this GET request on the result, I'm going to have all this data, right? I have this username, daily tuition, and we have this data in the MongoDB database. Now just for that, I want to show this data right down here inside this table. Now what I want to display this user data right inside this table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just back to this result table.js component. Right here, I have the hard-coded value. At the top, let me just specify the use effect, the React hook, and inside this use effect, I'm going to call here get server data helper function. So I'm going to say here get server data helper function from the helper.js file. So when I press enter, this will automatically import that file right inside this component. Just for that, as a first argument, we need to specify the URL. As you know, I need to specify here template string, and in the object right here, I'm going to specify process.env and then specify the variable name, this one. I wanted to make a GET request on / API result. And just for that, I'm going to return that data and specify that to the use state. So I'm just going to say here use state. So at the top, I'm going to first say constant data and set data is equal to use state. I'm going to call it React hook use state, and the default value is empty array. And then this function is going to return a callback function with data, right? Or you can specify here variable name response, and you get that response and specify that to this set data, to this variable using this set data function. So we pass here response. So now once we have the backend data inside this data variable, I can now iterate over it and specify that right inside this table body. So to do that, at the top, let me first specify an object and say if we don't have data, if we don't have any data, then return a division tag with no data found. Or if we have data, then I'm going to call here an object and say data.map and iterate over it. So I'm going to pass here v for value and I for index. Iterate over this data, and right inside this, I'm going to put this table row something like this. And then don't forget to uniquely identify this table row. So you have to specify here a key and pass here index value. And instead of these default values, get rid of it. Pass here an object and pass v dot question mark dot username. Now if you back to the data, you will notice here you have username, result, attempts, points, and achieve properties. So you're going to have all these properties. So you have to access that right here. I'm going to specify username. If I don't have username, then specify the default value null. Just out of that, I'm going to specify here an object, say v question mark dot attempts, and then specify here default value 0. Let me do the same for the earn points as well. In the object, I'm going to specify v question mark dollar. Now, if we don't have this property, then don't return any error and return 0. And let me do the same for this last one as well. So here I'm going to pass v question mark dollar achieved. Pass here nothing if we don't have anything here. I'm not going to get anything here. This is because we pass here parentheses. We need to return this data, right? So we need to get rid of these curly braces and pass here parentheses. You're going to have your data inside this table. Now if I restart this examination, specify the username. For example, if I specify here YouTube, start quiz, select the right answer first and leave this question as it is and select here stringify. When I press next, this will finish this examination. Now I'm passed in the exam. Attempt only 4 from 5. Points is 30 and I have the username YouTube. Oops, I think I misspelled something here. The username is daily tuition. I need to change this daily tuition to username. If I back to the result, right down here, I need to change this daily tuition to the username. So what I can do is I'm simply going to say here user ID and then specify that right here. You can see now I'm going to have this YouTube username. And when I resave this application, this will insert this data again inside the MongoDB database. You will notice. That's it. I hope you understand how to create this beautiful quiz application using MERN Stack. If you want to download this application, the link is in the description. If you have any question, don't forget to comment. Like this video if you find anything useful. Subscribe for more latest videos. That is all for now. I will see you in the next one.